Among the many mysteries kept safe in the shadows of the Vatican walls, the concern about vampires is one of the most interesting. Hidden behind centuries of teachings are clues, old items and stories that show how the Church in the past paid a lot of attention to these beings. Tonight, we follow the path of those hidden documents, wondering why this worry still lives on in sacred memory. If you like exploring these mysteries, don't forget to subscribe. Now, get comfortable, the story is about to begin. Inside the Vatican, a special silence reigns, unlike any other. It's not just quiet, it's a weight, as if centuries are pressing down on the ancient stones. The marble floors are always gleaming. The golden light from the stained glass windows is dim and still. And yet, for those who know how to look, there are clues of something more ancient hidden in the darkness. In a hallway, near the oldest part of the Apostolic Palace, there's a door that has been sealed for decades. A faded plaque next to it once bore an inscription, but it has been erased so many times that it's now unreadable. The few who pass through that area of the palace usually keep their eyes straight ahead, as if they don't want to look, or perhaps as if they fear something might be looking at them. An old prelate once said that forgotten terror was kept inside. He whispered that the Church had known many fears throughout its 1,000-year history, but one, above all others, had been hidden so deeply that almost no one remembered it was real anymore. He never spoke it openly, but in quiet moments, when the lamps burned low and the air grew cold, he would draw a symbol on the table with his finger. A curved line, a sharp point, then another. They looked like fangs. Before cardinals existed, before bishops wore red robes, there were stories. They came from the eastern jungles, from small settlements where candles were lit not just for devotion but for defence. They were tales of pale figures who wandered after death, who fed on blood, and who fled the symbol of the cross. Some called them monstrous creatures. Others feared they were something worse. Long ago, a word now barely whispered, Nosferatu, appeared in ecclesiastical archives, used in the past to refer to the deceased who found no rest. Most of the evidence was burned, sealed, or scattered, yet some elements survive, buried in the oldest repositories. Warnings written in Latin, trembling with dread, begging Rome to send help. Cursed settlements, bodies that didn't decompose, missing priests. The Church reacted not with public interventions, but with silence. These were not topics to preach to the faithful. These were not stories meant to be known. Over time, these stories were dismissed, catalogued as mythology, forgotten by almost everyone, but within the Vatican, some never stopped watching. The forgotten terror never truly disappeared. It simply sank deeper into the depths. And tonight we follow that silence into the past, into the dark corners of faith where even the splendour of the basilica cannot reach. Let's begin. Far below the Vatican, away from the crowded museums and sumptuous halls, there is a place where few have walked. The deeper you go, the colder the air becomes, and the walls seem to close in. Here the most ancient documents are kept, not those displayed to visiting scholars, nor those recited aloud by religious figures. These are the silent records kept on dusty shelves behind iron gates, where the light is dim and silence is absolute. Many years ago, a young archivist named Paolo worked in one of these rooms. His task was simple: clean, move boxes, check that no page was missing from the old records. He wasn't allowed to read them, but one night when everyone else had left and the upper corridors were silent, Paolo discovered something no one had prepared him for. It was hidden in the bottom drawer of a locked cabinet wrapped in a brown cloth. Inside was a single envelope. The thick yellowed paper bore the seal of a long-dead bishop on the back. Paolo opened it cautiously, his hands trembling, more from curiosity than fear. Inside he found 3 folded pages, each stained by time. The ink had turned dark brown, the writing difficult to decipher. A mix of Latin and the local language of a vanished people, but one word emerged, repeated several times in hurried, messy handwriting: Nosferatu. Each time it appeared, it had been scraped with a blade, as if someone had tried to remove it unsuccessfully. Paolo kept reading, and the message became understandable. The letter came from a small monastery near the Carpathians in the year 1724. It told the story of a man who died in winter, whose body refused to decompose. The monks buried him. But every morning the grave appeared desecrated. Soon after, dead animals were found, then people, each pale, without injuries, except for a small mark on the neck. The letter begged the Vatican to send help, but at the end of the third page, the handwriting changed. A final line had been added, more shaky than the previous ones, as if traced in the dark. "He's not dead. We were wrong. Seal this place. Never come back here." There was no answer in the drawer. Only silence. Paolo refolded the pages and put them back. He never spoke of what he had found, but from that day on he avoided the lower archives. He claimed the atmosphere down there felt different, as if it were watching. Not all Vatican secrets are protected by locks. Some simply wait to be discovered, others whisper warnings, hoping someone will hear them before it's too late. Inside the Vatican Library, where the air smells of parchment and wax, Bibles older than many nations are preserved. Some are handwritten, with pages turned by monks who lived before electricity or running water. The ink is faded, the bindings cracked, but the words remain. These volumes are kept not only for their beauty, but for what they contain. Versions of the scriptures that have passed through many hands, each of which has left a mark of its time. Some of these ancient volumes contain more than just verses. In the margins of the pages, in the narrow spaces between the lines, annotations appear, small messages written in Latin, Greek, or even more ancient languages. They are called marginalia. Most are simple reflections or prayers, but sometimes a more unsettling annotation emerges. In a Bible copied in the early 14th century, a monk wrote about the curse of blood in a village on the banks of the Danube. He narrated that the inhabitants feared a figure who walked at night and fed on the weak. The monk warned that not even the symbol of the cross had any effect, and that the name of Christ was met with mockery. His annotation ended with these words: "The demon hides in flesh that does not decompose." In another 15th century Bible, the margin of a psalm was marked with a disturbing symbol, a circle with two sharp points. A later annotation explained that this sign was used by priests to indicate those who had died, but did not stay that way. Next to the symbol read, "Deliver me from bloodshed, O God." Some believe the connection was not accidental. Over the years, scholars noticed these silent annotations. For some, they were just superstitions, but others began to glimpse a pattern, references to blood, to darkness, and to an unnatural life, hidden in the margins of sacred texts written by men who had lived through plagues, wars, and fears. Some priests began to call it the shadow between the lines. The Church has never discussed it publicly. Most of these annotations have been removed from accessible copies, but the originals remain, preserved in the Vatican's private repositories, visible only to a few. A former librarian once stated that the oldest texts are not dangerous for what they say, but for what they imply. That something has always moved just beyond the light of faith, something ancient, something the Church feared enough to write it down in the quietest places, where only the most attentive would have noticed it. These annotations, little more than ink whispers, prove nothing, but they raise a question that floats like smoke in a stone room. If the Church never believed in the undead, why did so many of its oldest guardians write as if they did? Sometimes the scriptures speak loudest in the silence between the words. In the year 1579, a letter arrived at the Holy Office of the Inquisition. It had travelled slowly, passing from hand to hand. crossing towns, forests, and mountains before reaching the Vatican. The handwriting was hurried and messy, the ink thicker in certain spots, as if the hand that wrote it trembled. It had been written by a priest, Father Alonso, who had faithfully served his village for over 20 years. The letter was concise, but what it contained was enough to disturb even the most experienced inquisitors. It began with a basic greeting, as was customary, and quickly shifted to a more urgent tone. Father Alonso wrote that his village had fallen into a strange darkness. It had started silently, animals found without blood. Then came the deaths, 4 in a single week, each marked by paleness, and 2 small marks near the neck. The inhabitants thought it was a plague, but Father Alonso wrote that he had seen the reality with his own eyes. He had buried one of the victims, a young man named Matteo. 3 days later, Matteo had been seen standing at the edge of the forest, his eyes dark, his mouth, they said, stained red. The next morning, another body was found. People began to panic. They gathered in the church, begging for help. Father Alonso did all he could. He prayed, burned incense, even sprinkled holy water around the graves, but it was no use. In the letter, he asked the Inquisition for permission to perform a forgotten rite, not to bless, but to contain. He called it the ritus sanguinis, the rite of blood. It wasn't in most missals, but he claimed to have found it in the last pages of an old book hidden in the chapel's basement. The last lines of the letter were unsettling. Father Alonso wrote, "I believe this thing does not belong to men. It walks like us, speaks like us, but does not die like us. I have closed the chapel. I will stay with it tonight. If I do not write again, let this be my last prayer." No document was ever found proving a response from the Inquisition. No subsequent letter, no confirmation that anyone had been sent to help. The village itself disappeared from maps a few decades later, perhaps due to plague or abandonment, but the letter survived, kept in a sealed file marked as unconfirmed heresy. It now rests in a drawer in the Vatican's reserved archive, consulted only by a few researchers under watchful eyes. Some claim the Church didn't respond because it feared the story was true. Others believe Father Alonso had gone mad, broken by illness or fear, but the signs he described, pale skin, blood, return from the grave, match stories passed down in many other places over many other years. And sometimes silence is the way the Church chooses to speak. In the spring of 1723, a disturbing report reached Rome. It had travelled slowly, passed from hand to hand, crossing towns, forests and mountains, before arriving at the Vatican. The letter came from Moravia, a quiet region of Central Europe, where communities of simple peasants lived in peace with the Church. But what the letter described was anything but peaceful. The message had been written by a bishop stationed in Brno, the largest city in the area. He was not a man prone to believing stories. His writing was firm, his words clear, and yet what he recounted was unlike anything the Church had faced before. Within a few weeks, dozens of people in nearby villages had died suddenly. Each had been found in bed, eyes wide open, skin white as snow, and a small cut near the neck. There were no signs of illness, no fever, no injury, except for that mark. At first they thought it was a disease, but the bodies didn't decay. Days passed, then weeks, and the dead remained intact, unchanged. The villagers begged the bishop to act. One night, a group of men unearthed a coffin buried 9 days earlier. When they opened it, they screamed. The body inside seemed alive. Its mouth was open, red around the lips. Blood stained the corners. The bishop called it a trick of decomposition, but this did not calm the people. According to the report, the locals did something the Church strictly forbade. They extracted the heart, and when they did, it moved. Only once, but it was enough. They immediately burned it along with the body, in silence. After that night, No other deaths were reported in that village. The bishop was torn. He could not approve of what had been done, but he also could not deny what he had seen. So he wrote to Rome begging for guidance, asking if the church had ever faced a similar evil. He called it the curse of blood and feared it was spreading. The Vatican's response was never found. Some claim it was burned, others believe it was added to a special file known only to a few high prelates. But one thing is certain. After the letter arrived, a group of Jesuits was quietly sent east. They wore no religious habits, carried no crosses, and never spoke of their mission upon returning. In the following years, the church began to collect local stories about spectres more carefully, always in secret. Many of these records are still hidden in the Vatican archives, marked with strange symbols and kept in sealed drawers. The blood curse of Moravia was never again mentioned publicly, but within the stone walls of the Vatican, it was never forgotten. Some stains, it is said, cannot be washed away with holy water. Long before the Vatican rose in Rome, long before popes wore white robes and led prayers from golden balconies, people across Europe worshipped other gods. They were not kind gods. They were spirits of the forests and mountains, gods of fire and storms, creatures of the night. Some brought blessings, others demanded blood. In the deep forests of what is now Romania, Hungary and parts of Poland, ancient stories were told around fires. They spoke of the strigoi, beings that looked like men but fed on life itself. They rose from the grave, passed through walls, and sucked the strength from the living. These were not mere legends. People left food outside their homes to keep them away, buried the dead with iron stakes, stones in their mouths, or rocks on their chests so they couldn't rise. When Christianity began to spread across Europe, the church faced a problem. It couldn't erase these beliefs all at once. People feared what they had always feared. So, in some places, instead of eradicating the old stories, the church quietly transformed them. Pagan spirits became demons, forest gods became fallen angels, and in rare cases, those who were once feared became saints. One of these stories dates back to the early 15th century. A small village in the Carpathians revered a woman they called the Mother of the Red Moon. They believed she kept the strigoi away. She was never buried, but merely enclosed in a cave surrounded by candles. When Christian priests arrived, they were shocked to see her worshipped as a saint, but the people insisted. She had saved them from the blood drinkers. Instead of fighting that belief, the church gave her a new name, Saint Lucy of the Shadows. For a time, she was included in a local list of protectors, but her name never appeared in Rome. After a few decades, her story disappeared from official records. Her shrine, once covered in flowers, was walled up with stone. Other cases followed a similar path. A man once feared as a night walker in eastern Serbia was transformed into a watchful martyr. A boy who was believed to rise each year on the night of his death became the young protector of souls. But in each of those tales, the darkness never quite disappeared. People still whispered at night, still lit candles when the moon turned red. In the Vatican archives, researchers found traces of this transformation. Latin notes mention conversions of customs and reinterpretations of regional beliefs. One note even says, "The blood god will now carry the cross." By changing the stories, the church hoped to tame fear. But in doing so, perhaps they only gave the old myths new names and new faces. The strigoi didn't disappear. They simply walked into the light, disguised as saints, remembered in silence. And still today, in small chapels where no one prays aloud, their candles still burn. In the early 17th century, Jesuit missionaries were among the most reliable and disciplined servants of the church. They weren't just teachers and priests. They were trained for the most difficult missions, sent to distant lands where faith had not yet taken root, or where danger waited silently. Some were sent to Asia, others to America, but some were sent to an even closer and darker place. A group of Jesuits was sent to the eastern edge of Europe, to a chain of mountain villages near what is now the border between Romania and Ukraine. These villages were remote and quiet, isolated by forests and long winters. Rumours had reached Rome of strange beliefs spread among these people, ancient stories mixed with Catholic tradition in ways that disturbed the church. The inhabitants spoke of the guardians of the night, figures who roamed in the hours before dawn looking for houses without prayers, doors without salt, and breathless bodies. They were said to be the dead, returned from the grave, walking silently among the living. Their eyes were dark, their shadows moved without light, and their presence brought a cold that no fire could break. The Jesuits arrived with Bibles and rosaries, ready to correct what they considered pagan lies, but the people did not argue. On the contrary, they welcomed the priests with food and firewood, asked for blessings, and joined in prayers. But when night fell, everything changed. The villages locked their doors early and lit candles in every window. No one walked after dark. The confused Jesuits asked why. An old man just said, "Because they come when the world forgets to pray." A missionary, Father Miguel, kept a diary. He wrote that the village seemed normal during the day, but at night it was filled with fear. He noted that even animals became restless after dark. He said he had heard footsteps on the church roof, scratches on the doors, and soft, distant voices calling the names of the deceased. One night, Father Miguel followed those sounds into the forest. He never wrote what he saw, only that he returned pale, mute, and unable to speak for 3 days. His last note simply read, "They are not stories." A few months later, the Jesuits left the village. The mission was declared complete, but no report was ever submitted to Rome. Only one letter remains in the archive, sealed and unsigned, which reads, "Faith is not enough when the very earth remembers blood." The Jesuits never returned to that region, and still today some claim that the guardians of the night roam those mountain paths, moving among the trees just beyond the reach of candlelight. They are not seen, but they are felt, like a shadow brushing the edge of sleep. And the Vatican, once so eager to spread the truth in every corner, chose to remain silent. Some doors, it seems, are better left closed. Inside the Vatican Museum there is a silent room filled with display cases. Inside each display case are preserved relics, bones, pieces of cloth, and objects attributed to saints. Some are simple and small, others are covered in gold and precious stones. They are nothing more than historical objects, but for the Church they are sacred. Each relic is labelled, guarded, and protected, except one. For many years there was a relic said to be the skull of St. Andrew, one of the 12 apostles and brother of St. Peter. It was kept in a silver reliquary shaped like a crown, displayed only on special feast days. Pilgrims came from afar just to kneel before it, but one day, in the early 20th century, it disappeared. There was no announcement, no letter, no explanation. The reliquary remained motionless on its velvet cushion, but the skull inside had vanished. When an explanation was requested, church officials said it had been moved for conservation reasons, but no one could say where, and no document recorded its destination. Years later, a retired former museum worker quietly spoke of what she had seen the night before the disappearance. She said that a group of men in simple black robes had entered the museum after closing. They didn't say a word. They carried a wooden box and went directly to the relic room without hesitation. No one stopped them. They had Vatican seals and official documents, but the woman remembered that there was something about the way they moved that didn't seem right. She said the room grew colder after they left. Whispers began to circulate. Some believed the skull had been stolen. Others murmured that it had never belonged to St. Andrew. But one voice was different. It came from a scholar who had spent his life among ancient letters and church records. He maintained that for centuries some priests had doubted the relic, not because they doubted its sanctity, but because it did not decay. According to him, the skull showed no signs of aging, did not crack, did not darken, and once, during a private vision, a witness claimed to have seen the mouth move slightly, like a breath or a spasm. The scholar claimed that the Vatican had decided to remove it, not to protect it, but to hide it. Now the reliquary still lies in its display case, empty. The label only says, "Relic of St. Andrew, temporarily removed," but it has borne that inscription for many years, and when an explanation is requested, the Church offers no details. Some say the skull is hidden in the archives, others believe it has been returned to the earth. But there are also those who wonder if it was ever truly dead. In the Vatican, where faith meets mystery, not every relic rests in peace. Some are moved, others forgotten, and some perhaps still watch. There is a locked drawer in the Vatican archives, unlabelled, unlocked, with no official record. A small bronze plaque marks its number. Obscura 14 lies at the bottom, hidden behind old containers and folders, far from the shelves exposed to visiting scholars. Few know what it contains, and even fewer why it was locked, but in that compartment is kept what is only known as the Balkan file. The file is thin, bound in dark leather, and carries with it a smell of smoke and dust. Its pages contain handwritten reports, some dating back to 1892, from priests, soldiers, and even a railway employee. All narrate events that occurred in a narrow strip of territory, extending from southern Serbia to northern Bulgaria, in the heart of the Balkan Mountains. The reports speak of countries without bell towers, of temples always closed, and of the deceased buried twice, not once, but twice, first in the earth, then again in the flames. In one episode, a priest writes about 3 recent burials discovered above an ancient Roman ruin. When he opened them, he found no bodies, but only blood-soaked earth and strange wooden posts split in half. Another report comes from a small convent near the Montenegro border. The religious guarded a volume passed down from age to age. The cover was black cloth, and the title, in Old Church Slavonic translated, read, "The Children of the Night." The volume contained illustrations, pale figures with sharp fingers and empty eyes, emerging from graves in the moonlight. Each page showed symbols of protection, invocations against the undead, and ways to stop them. It was not fantasy. The religious treated it as a manual, one of the most disturbing parts of the file. It is a missive written in red ink. It has no signature, but it bears the seal of a cardinal. The missive warns that some areas of the Balkans should be avoided, not because of war or plague, but because of something older, something that the Church, it says, cannot bless or completely destroy. The last page of the file is in Italian, and reads, "Keep this file sealed, do not add, do not remove. This knowledge is not for the public or for the pulpit, and it is signed only with the initials PXII, the same as Pope Pius XIII. Why would a pontiff have signed such a warning? And why would the Vatican have kept such accounts without ever speaking of them? Some believe the file was collected not out of fear, but out of respect, a silent way of saying that these things were seen, though never confessed, that in those mountains where faith and folklore meet, the Church once watched and remembered, and still the compartment remains sealed, Obscura 14, untouched, waiting. In the early days of the Church, heresy was not considered a mistake, but a threat to the soul. Speaking against the teachings of Rome meant inviting darkness into the world. The Inquisition was created to protect the faithful, to silence dangerous ideas, to root out anything that could shake the foundations of faith. But what happens when fear is not just an idea, but a creature? The Church never officially recognized vampires. To do so would have given strength to the stories. And yet, behind closed doors, in secret letters and reports, signs of something strange appeared again and again. Villages that spoke of the dead walking again, corpses that refused to decay, shadows that moved without light. In every corner of Europe, these whispers spread faster than the Church could erase them. In public, the Vatican called them superstition. It was said that people were scared by illness, madness, or sadness. But in secret, the Church began to worry. It was not the stories themselves that were so dangerous, but the reaction of the people. In certain places, the fear of vampires began to replace trust in priests. Instead of asking for holy water, people sharpened wooden stakes. Instead of invocations, they relied on amulets and secret rituals. They even dug up graves without permission, burning the bodies they feared. This, for the Church, was heresy. A heretic did not always speak against God. Sometimes they simply believed in something else, something stronger, and through the campaigns it became clear that the fear of the undead grew more than faith in the Church. It was a problem the Vatican could not ignore. In 1662, a report from southern Poland reached Rome. A local priest had been removed from his post because he refused to prevent the faithful from performing a ritual against vampires. He maintained that these actions had a basis in truth. He claimed to have seen one of the deceased return. The Church not only replaced him, but burned his writings and erased his name from the records. Another episode, in northern Italy in the early 18th century, spoke of a woman accused of being undead after having survived an illness that had killed her entire family. She was alive, but pale, and neighbours said they had seen her walking at night. The bishop ordered her to stay home after dark, not because she was guilty, but because people considered her so, and for the Church conviction was as dangerous as reality. To admit that vampires were real would have meant opening the door to everything the Church had always tried to control, but to completely ignore the stories could lead to panic, rebellion, and loss of faith. So the Church did what it always does when faced with something too strange to accept. It buried it in silence, labelled it heresy, and turned the page. But not all fears fade with time. Some beliefs, like the creatures they describe, refuse to die. Ravenna is a quiet city in northern Italy, famous for its churches and mosaics that shine like gold under the sun. But beneath the beauty lie older layers, dark passages, forgotten graves, and rarely told stories. One of these stories begins with a wall that should never have been opened. In 1927, during restoration work on the Basilica of San Vitale, workers discovered something unusual. Behind a section of stone different from the rest of the wall, they found a hidden chamber. It was small, cold, windowless, and had a single entrance. At first it seemed like a simple storage room, perhaps used centuries before by the religious. But when the lamps illuminated the space, what they saw left them paralysed. On the back wall was a fresco, painted directly on the stone. It depicted a pontiff before an altar, with a chalice in his hand, but this was no ordinary mass. The chalice did not contain wine. It was red, thick, and dark, and dripped onto the pontiff's fingers, his eyes wide. They did not look to the sky, but directly at the viewer. Around him were figures in shadow, their faces hidden, each holding a leaf with Latin words written in blood. No church archive mentions that fresco. No document speaks of its creation or its purpose. The workers were ordered to close the chamber and not to speak of it to anyone, but one of them, a man named Marco, secretly made a sketch of the fresco before the wall was bricked up again. Years later, on his deathbed, he gave that drawing to a local priest, with a note that said only, "It was not wine." The sketch eventually reached a historian who studied forgotten ancient church rituals. Comparing the Latin words in the drawing with old manuscripts, she found something disturbing. They corresponded to parts of a lost rite, whispered but never confirmed, a ritual known only as sanguinem Dei, the blood of God. It was believed to have been used in times of great fear, when priests thought darkness had penetrated the church itself. It was not part of the Roman Missal, nor was it ever approved by a pontiff, but it appears in letters from isolated monasteries, mentioned as an extreme measure to drive away the impure. The details were always vague, but one thing was clear: the rite required true blood, that of the celebrant. No official comment was ever made about the fresco. The Vatican declared that the chamber was empty and unimportant. However, on the basilica's plan, that space was never again marked, as if it had been erased along with the memory of what happened there. But in Ravenna, among the ancient stones and silent chapels, there are still those who speak of the fresco that stared and the blood that never dried. Beneath the luminous dome of St. Peter's Basilica lies a hidden world that most visitors will never see. Silence reigns down there, where sunlight does not reach, and the walls are ancient, older than the church itself. This underground space is known as the Vatican Necropolis, a cemetery that stretches beneath the altar. Many believe that St. Peter, one of the first apostles, the rock on which the church was built, rests there. Guided tours are only allowed for small groups, along carefully chosen routes. The air is cold and still, the lights dim. Tourists walk among ancient graves, worn engravings and Latin inscriptions. On the surface, peace reigns, but some who have worked for years in the necropolis tell another story, a quieter one that is not revealed to visitors. A former guide named Lorenzo once said that not all passages under St. Peter are open to the public. He spoke of a section beyond a sealed iron gate, where the floor descends and the walls change appearance. There, he said, the stone is darker and the inscriptions are different, figures with long arms, empty eyes, and sharp teeth hidden under robes. Lorenzo went there only once, late at night, when a high official took him along to transport equipment. He said the silence in that part of the necropolis was not like the rest. It was heavier, the kind of silence that presses on the chest and makes it hard to breathe. In a corner, he saw a bricked-up passage, an arch filled with bricks and sealed. Above it was engraved in Latin a short phrase, "Do not disturb the sleep of the bloodless." When Lorenzo asked what it meant, the official ordered him never to speak of it again. In the following years, other workers have reported strange events, a draft where there shouldn't be one, flickering lights that stabilized as soon as they were observed. A guard claimed to have heard whispers in an ancient language despite being alone. Another said he had followed footsteps leading to a wall with no door or trace of a passage. The church has never confirmed these accounts. It explains that the lower necropolis is dangerous for visitors and is closed for conservation reasons. But maps before 1950 show more galleries than are indicated today. Some paths have simply disappeared from official documents as if they had never existed. St. Peter stands as a symbol of faith in the glory and light of Rome, but beneath it lies something older, something the Church prefers not to name. There are those who say that only history rests there. In the shadows, others believe that something else also rests there. Something that never truly died. In 1662, a singular order departed from the Vatican to some monasteries scattered throughout Europe. It arrived in the form of a silent decree, written in Latin and delivered by hand. The message was brief but unequivocal. All mirrors were to be removed from the private cells of the religious and from the prayer rooms. No reason was given. There was no explanation. The mirrors were simply taken away, covered with cloth, and put into locked basements. Today, almost no one knows about this rule. It was never made public, but the letters still exist, kept among the oldest archives of the Vatican. Some were found by a scholar researching forgotten rites. She noticed that the same monasteries had always received identical copies. These were remote places where strange events had been quietly reported. One of them was a small abbey in the Austrian Alps. The monks lived in silence, spending their days in prayer and study. But according to an old diary written by the prior, something had begun to disturb them. At first it was just a feeling, a nighttime chill that lingered despite the fires burning. Then came the shadows. The monks said they saw something moving at the edges of the room, out of the corner of their eye. But when they turned, there was nothing. Soon one of the brothers refused to sleep in his cell. He claimed that every time he looked in his mirror, a second reflection appeared next to his own. The figure was pale, with empty eyes and no mouth. It didn't move, but it watched. Another monk reported that his own reflection didn't exactly follow his movements. When he raised his hand, the image took a second. He said it was as if something was pretending to be him. The prior contacted the church. A few weeks later, the letter arrived. The mirrors were removed that very night. The troubles, according to the diary, stopped almost immediately. Other monasteries reported similar stories, reflections that flickered late, faces that didn't match the expressions of the viewer, and, in one instance, a monk who disappeared completely, leaving only a cracked mirror and a note in Latin that read, "Walk behind the glass." Why was the church concerned about mirrors? For most, they are just objects, but in ancient folklore, they were often considered subtle doorways, places where the soul and shadow could meet, and in legends about the undead, vampires were known to have no reflection. The church never made this prohibition official. Over time, the rule faded and was forgotten. But in certain places, where the air is still thick and the past seems close, mirrors remain set aside, covered, hidden, just in case, because not all doors have to open for something to pass through. Sometimes a reflection is enough. In the year 1781, 5 Jesuit priests left Rome on a mission to the heart of the Carpathians. Their goal was simple: to reach a group of isolated villages that the church hadn't visited in over a generation. These villages, surrounded by dense forests and rocky hills, were known for keeping strange customs, a mix of ancient pagan beliefs and Christian symbols. The priests were to offer guidance, perform baptisms, and bring these souls fully into the light of the church. Their names were recorded: Father Antonio, Father Giuseppe, Brother Luca, Brother Martino, and the youngest, Father Elia, ordained only the year before. They carried Bibles, rosaries, sacramental oils, and a leather-bound diary for their notes. They were expected to return in 6 weeks. They never did. Weeks turned into months. The Vatican sent letters to nearby parishes asking for news. Some villages reported seeing the Jesuits pass through the outermost towns, heading towards the mountain path. Then nothing, no letters, no messengers, not even rumours, as if they had vanished into the trees. A year later, another priest, travelling through the same region, visited a small church near the Hungarian border. There he found something strange. Hidden beneath the floorboards was a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside was Father Elia's diary. Most of the pages were blank, except for the first few. The initial entries were serene, descriptions of long roads, kind villages, and invocations recited at dusk. But soon the tone changed. Father Elia began to write about sleepless nights. He said they heard voices in the forests, soft and distant, in a language no one knew. One night they found a dead animal near the fire, its body intact, but all its blood gone. Another time, Brother Luca woke up with scratches on his arms, and no memory of what had happened. In the last entry, Father Elia spoke of a village where people didn't speak after dark. Crosses were upside down, doors marked with red ash. The village priest told them to leave before sunset. He added, "We no longer pray here, he listens." The diary ended with a single sentence: "We are not alone." The Vatican quietly retrieved the diary. No public announcement was made. An investigation was discussed, but no one was ever sent. The mission was officially recorded as incomplete due to unknown circumstances. The names of the 5 priests were never again spoken in official documents. Today, no trace of that mission's path remains in the Carpathians. The villages have changed or disappeared, but some say that if you walk those mountain trails at dusk, you can hear footsteps behind you or catch the faint scent of incense on the wind. And in the heart of the Vatican, that lost mission remains a silent wound, sealed but never truly closed. In the spring of 1933, a journalist named Thomas Bell arrived in Rome with a notebook full of questions. He wrote for a small European magazine, covering unusual stories from all over the world. Forgotten countries, strange beliefs, secret places. But this time he had something different in mind. He had come to ask the Vatican about spectres. Thomas was not a sensationalist storyteller. He didn't believe in ghosts or monsters. But during a visit to a convent in southern France, he had stumbled upon something. A priest had told him about the Pale Ones, not as a myth, but as a memory. He said the Vatican once kept files on these beings, episodes of bodies that wouldn't decay, people buried and then seen walking, rituals long forgotten. The idea never left him. He began to search. In old newspapers he found traces of these stories across Europe. In war records he found towns designated as abandoned due to unnatural causes. In a private collection he found a letter from a cardinal warning about a place called the 13th Crypt, so Thomas requested an interview. To his surprise, the Vatican agreed. He was told to report to a side entrance of the Apostolic Palace, where a Monsignor would meet him and lead him to a private room. The letter was formal, sealed with the Holy See's emblem and signed by a Father Giuliani. But when Thomas arrived at the gates, everything changed. The Swiss guard checked his documents and then spoke quietly on the phone. After long minutes, a different man appeared. Not the one from the letter, dressed in black, nameless. He told Thomas the interview had been cancelled. No explanation. When Thomas asked about Father Giuliani, he was told that no priest with that name existed in the Vatican. That night, returning to his hotel, he discovered his key no longer worked. The porter said the room had already been vacated. All his belongings were gone. Only the notebook, which he always carried in his coat, remained. Uneasy, he left Rome the next morning. A few weeks later, he wrote a letter to his editor describing everything that had happened. He never received a reply. Years later, a researcher found Thomas's unpublished account in the magazine's archives. It had been written, but never printed. In the margin appeared a sentence. "They told me to forget it, but I can't." No one really knows what Thomas Bell found or who wanted to hide it, but one thing is for sure, the interview had been promised, prepared, and then cancelled, and sometimes the most terrifying silence is the one that follows a question no one wants answered. There's a strange rumour circulating among a few scholars of church history. It's not found in textbooks nor in public documents, and it's never spoken aloud within the Vatican walls, but for over 100 years it has accompanied the church like a shadow. It's the rumour that one of the pontiffs never decomposed. The story begins in the late 19th century, shortly after the death of Pope Benedict IX, not to be confused with his namesakes. This Benedict reigned for only a short time, before dying under silent and unusual circumstances. Some said he was inspired in a dream, others spoke of a strange illness that would have marked his last days, but the true mystery began after the burial. Normally, when a pontiff dies, his body is carefully prepared, blessed, and laid to rest beneath the Vatican. Over time, despite the best preservation techniques, decomposition progresses, but when church officials checked Benedict's remains months later, they were terrified. The body had not changed, the skin was pale, but not dry, the lips still had colour. His eyes, it was whispered, seemed only closed in sleep. The rumour spread through the innermost circles. One priest reportedly whispered, "He does not rest." Wait. Another, after seeing him, refused to return to that part of the crypt. Years later, when a new group of officials was sent to examine the papal burials, they found Benedict's chamber sealed behind an iron gate, with no explanation. An archivist who asked questions was told that burial must not be disturbed further. The legend grew even stranger when an old custodian, who had worked for decades under the basilica, confided an unwritten episode to a visitor. He said that once, during cleaning, he had seen a man in white vestments walk through the underground passages. He thought he was a priest until he noticed that his footsteps made no sound and that his shadow fell in the wrong direction. The man vanished around a corner. No one believed the story, but the custodian swore it to his death. Naturally, the church denies everything. There are no official records that speak of strange events related to Pope Benedict IX. His name is barely mentioned in public documents, and his burial does not appear on many maps. But for those who study the hidden sides of the church, the rumour persists, not because it proves anything, but because it refuses to fade. Some say the body is still there, intact, outside of time. Others believe it has been moved, hidden in an inaccessible place, and a few, the quietest ones, whisper that there is something older at play, something that once wore the fisherman's ring and still walks under the stone today. For centuries, the Catholic Church has had a deep and complex relationship with the deceased. In churches across Europe, the bones of saints are displayed in glass cases, skulls are placed on altars, fingers are kept in golden chests. These relics do not inspire fear, but are revered. The faithful travel from afar to kneel before them, hoping for healings or signs, but not all bodies receive the same respect, and not all deaths are treated in the same way. There are rules about how the church faces death. Some bodies rest in consecrated ground, blessed and remembered forever. Others, however, are deprived of it. Often these were people accused of dark crimes, of heresy, or worse. In many instances, even without a trial, the Church refused to grant them a sacred burial. The question is why? In the Vatican archives, there are discreet allusions to particular exhumations, moments when the Church decided to unearth a body already buried. Sometimes it was to move the relics of a saint. Other times the reason was unclear. A body could be removed, burned, or reburied in an unmarked grave far from the city. These episodes are rare, but real. One occurred in 1769 in a convent just outside Vienna. A monk had died suddenly and was placed in the crypt. A few days later, a fellow monk said, "His skin remains soft, his body intact." When this happens, it is often considered a miracle, but not always. In certain episodes, the Church has chosen not to display these bodies, but has hidden them, sealed behind walls, as if it were necessary to prevent them from being seen. A body that does not decay can be a sign of holiness, or something else. There is also the question of those who were buried in silence. Over the years, some ecclesiastical officials were unceremoniously removed. No mass, no public notice. Some say it was due to serious faults. Others argue that their bodies behaved in ways that could not be explained. In the margin of an old burial record it reads, "Eyes open, no signs of decomposition, 3 days waited, no change." The Church speaks of life after death, of heaven and resurrection, but in the quietest corners of its history it also speaks in hushed tones of fear. Fear that not all deaths bring peace, that not all bodies rest, and that not even consecrated ground is enough to contain what has been buried from rising again. In the ancient Vatican records there are thousands of pages about exorcisms. These are sacred rites intended to drive away evil spirits from those believed to be possessed. The Church performs them with extreme care, using holy water, invocations, and the authority of trained priests. But looking closely at the oldest manuals, something strange is noticed. Rites that do not seem like common exorcisms. Some, in fact, resemble something else. Towards the end of the 19th century, a small book was written by a Vatican-trained exorcist, Father Vincenzo Malari. It was never published, but a copy remains guarded in the Apostolic Archive. Inside, he describes several episodes that did not respond to traditional rites. He writes about people who during the invocation seemed calm but had no reflection in mirrors. Others could not cross the threshold of a church, even if dragged by force. Some rejected all food except raw meat. Father Vincenzo did not call them possessed, but used an ancient Latin expression, morti nandom mortui, the dead who are not yet dead. An episode from northern Italy. He speaks of a woman found wandering near a convent, pale and weak, but alive. The villagers said she had been buried 3 days earlier. The grave was opened. The coffin was empty. The woman did not speak and did not allow anyone to touch her. When a priest tried to bless her with holy water, she recoiled and fled. The local bishop ordered an exorcism, but the rite did not go as planned. The priest who performed it later wrote that from the beginning he felt a sense of unease. The woman never screamed. She did not resist. She remained motionless, her gaze fixed. At the final invocation, she fell to the ground and stopped breathing. She was secretly buried that same night, and the truth was never disclosed. Another Vatican manual, written in the early 20th century, contains instructions for a special version of the rite. It is almost identical to an exorcism, except for one passage. After the last invocation, the priest is ordered to drive a wooden stake into the spot where the heart is located. The book does not explain why, it only says that it must be done in silence and with faith. This variant appears in only a few copies and was later removed from official teaching. The Church claimed that the modifications had been made for clarity, that old rites sometimes incorporated local traditions, but some think differently. They believe that the Church was aware of certain episodes that were not possessions, but something older, more difficult to explain. Thus, hidden among invocations and blessings, clues emerge, clues that suggest that some exorcisms were not meant to save the soul, but to stop the body, not to drive away a demon, but to prevent something from walking again, something with sharp teeth and no reflection. Throughout Europe, ancient villages have used simple things to protect themselves from darkness. Garlic hung on doors, crosses over beds, salt sprinkled on windowsills, signs of protection that date back many centuries, and if today they are considered folklore, their roots run deeper than is believed. Even the Church has quietly observed the use of these symbols and sometimes intervened when their meaning became too powerful. Garlic, for example, has always been believed to ward off evil. In many places, especially in the Balkans and some regions of Romania, garlic was planted near graves or rubbed on door frames on particular nights. It wasn't just a cooking herb, it was a shield. Vampires were said to hate its smell because it came from the earth, pure, natural, untouched by death. Garlic, they said, made the air too clean for the undead to enter. The cross has always been, without a doubt, a sacred symbol for the Church, an icon of protection, of faith, of the triumph of light against darkness. And yet, in certain regions, peasants carved crosses into trees, into stone walls, even into the flesh of the deceased. Their conviction went beyond simple faith. They considered the cross a true weapon. Not all of these traditions had the Church's blessing. In the early 1700s, several letters arrived from Jesuit institutions in Eastern Europe. The educators were deeply concerned. Their students were bringing garlic into the classroom, not to eat it, but to hide it under their desks. One report from a Hungarian boarding school spoke of young men flat out refusing to fall asleep without garlic tied to their rosaries. When asked, they admitted they feared the pale ones whispering through the cracks. The Church became alarmed. The cross was encouraged, but using garlic in holy places was not. In 1743, an internal memo was sent to several monasteries. Non-liturgical beliefs were to be tactfully removed. Garlic, salt, and other folk defences were to be replaced with prayers, not because they were dangerous, but because it was feared they would lead believers away from genuine faith and back to old pagan traditions. However, within the Church structure, there was no unanimity. Some priests, especially those working in mountainous areas, quietly allowed the old practices to continue. A correspondence found in the Vatican archives and marked confidential described a village where crosses and garlic garlands hung from every home. The religious man wrote, "Faith alone might not be enough against what comes in the dark. Let them hang what they deem necessary." Today, garlic and crosses belong to ancient legends about vampires, told in books and movies. However, In certain quiet corners of Europe, where the wind still moves strangely and nights seem excessively long, garlic is still placed near graves. Crosses are still carved into windows, and deep within the Vatican archives exist documents indicating how these symbols once not only served to reassure the living, but to repel something more, something that feared the consecrated and the immaculate. Deep beneath Vatican City, far beyond the marble halls and silent chapels, lies the Apostolic Archive. It's not a library open to the public, but a private vault protected by massive walls and guarded doors, where the Church's oldest and most confidential documents are kept. Some are known to scholars: letters from sovereigns, maps of lost territories, acts of forgotten councils. But there are also volumes that almost no one has ever consulted. One is titled Codex Umbrae, the Book of Shadows. It's written in Latin and ancient Greek, small in size but dense with pages, bound in dark leather that smells of smoke and damp stone. It has no author, no date, no place of origin. Its first appearance in Vatican records is marked only with Received, dated to the early 12th century. The content doesn't resemble scriptures or codes. Rather, it narrates a long, twisted story of a time when something dark roamed the hills of Thrace, an ancient region that included parts of Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey. The account speaks of pale figures who walked exclusively at night, feeding on the blood of animals and then people. They weren't called vampires in the book. They were called Scotardia, the shadowy ones. According to the Codex, a group of Christian monks was sent to investigate the strange occurrences. Entire villages fell silent. Bodies were discovered bloodless and icy cold, with no signs of a struggle. Initially, the monks assumed it was a disease, or perhaps demons, but what they found, the Codex says, had flesh but no breath, spoke but did not pray. The text becomes more complex to decipher from that point. Some pages are damaged, others seem written in code or cipher. But one thing is clear: the monks performed a ritual never mentioned in any other ecclesiastical document. They used crosses, fire, and the blood of a living man who had not yet sinned. They called it the rite of the binding. The last line of that section reads, "It didn't kill them, it sealed them." The Vatican has never officially confirmed the existence of the Codex Umbrae. Scholars who have discreetly heard of it report that anyone who asks to examine it is quietly turned away. But a former archivist, speaking anonymously before his death, confessed to having held it personally. He stated that the pages were warm. He said the cover pulsed slightly, like a heart. If the volume is authentic, it raises complex questions. Why would the Church have hidden such a text? And what truth is hidden in such an ancient tale that borders on oblivion? Some say it's just a myth. Others believe it's a warning, written in a time when the line between faith and fear was extremely thin, in a small mountain village in southern Italy. Far from metropolises and busy roads stands an ancient stone church that few visit. It remains silent, its bell broken for years and its doors more often closed than open. Local residents only speak of it marginally, and never after dark. They call it the Accia del Silenzio, the Church of Silence. Beneath this forgotten church exists a crypt that doesn't appear on any map. Access is hidden behind the altar. It looks like part of the wall, but if you press a certain stone and wait, the door slides open with a slight groan. Very few people know how to find it, and even fewer know what it hides. In 1925, a visiting priest, Father Matteo, was sent to inspect the church after a series of mysterious complaints. The village priest had fallen ill, and the bishop wanted someone to ensure the church remained in good hands. Father Matteo recorded what he observed in the pages of his private diary, recovered many years later in the diocesan archives. In his notes, he described the crypt as damp and narrow, with a heavy, dense atmosphere. Along the walls lay rows of stone sarcophagi. almost all marked with simple crosses, but in the deepest section, behind a rusty grate, he discovered a tomb unlike any other. It was sealed by a massive slab of black marble. Around the edges, hardened wax residue clung to the stone, as if many candles had burned there at some point. Engraved in the marble were Latin words, "Bound in silence, untouched by grace." But what truly disturbed Father Matteo was the symbol engraved in a circle around the tomb, an ancient sign used only once in Vatican history. According to hidden documents, that mark had been traced in the early 18th century on a tomb in Romania, a tomb that refused to stay closed. Next to the crypt, he found a small glass sealed with wax. Inside was a golden dense liquid, consecrated oil. Father Matteo immediately recognized it. It was an oil used exclusively in rare and powerful rituals. It was never left near a corpse, unless the church feared that body might return. Father Matteo never spoke publicly about what he had observed. He returned to Rome, submitted a brief report, and asked to be transferred. His diary remained hidden, ignored for decades, but those who later examined it noticed a disturbing detail. After that visit to the crypt, Father Matteo never again served as a priest. The crypt beneath the so-called Church of Silence remains locked. The tomb has never been opened. No one knows who or what is buried there, but the presence of that consecrated oil, the sealed grate, and that forgotten warning suggest only one thing. What rests in that stone sepulchre was not buried to be honoured, it was buried to be contained. In a locked drawer in the Vatican's cartography room, a map is kept that very few have seen. It doesn't resemble the elegant painted maps that adorn the walls, depicting the journeys of saints, pilgrimage routes, and the spread of the early church. This one is older, more austere, and not marked with cities or rivers, but by silence. It's called Zona Obscura, or Map of Forbidden Places. It has no date, but the parchment is blackened by time and the writing is archaic Latin, rarely employed after the 17th century. It shows regions of Europe, parts of North Africa, and scattered points in the Middle East. Each point is marked with a black cross and accompanied by a word, Claudette, closed. Unlike common maps, it doesn't indicate routes, it warns. Some of the marked places have no name, only coordinates. Others are small villages that have disappeared from modern records, but a few still exist, barely. One of them is in a Carpathian valley, marked with 2 black crosses and the Latin phrase Terra non bened, unblessed land. In church documents, that valley is cited as the site of a mission that disappeared in 1781. 5 priests went in, none returned. Another sign appears near the ruins of a monastery in southern France. That area was evacuated by the church after a fire in the early 17th century. Official reports spoke of lightning, but private annotations found in the margins of Vatican letters suggest otherwise. A phrase written in faded ink says, "No sign of struggle, only the blood remains." The most disturbing signs are those enclosed in circles. These circles, drawn in red, seem to indicate a particular importance or danger. One of them surrounds a village in northern Italy, where the church banned all public masses for 10 years. Another appears in Transylvania, next to a note that says, "Silence maintained since 1763. A retired archivist stated he had seen that map during his years cataloguing ancient Vatican documents. He said it was kept under glass, next to a sealed envelope marked with the initials B14, the initials of a pope. When asked why that map existed, he replied only, "There are places where faith does not walk alone." No one knows who created the map or how those sites were chosen, but the fact that it still exists, carefully preserved, suggests that the Vatican has not forgotten them. Perhaps these places are not avoided because of what happened there, but because of what might still be there. And so the map remains closed, rarely mentioned, never shown. Not a guide for travellers, but a warning for those who ask too many questions. Because certain places are not lost in time, they are hidden on purpose, marked not with names, but with silence. In 1922, a man named Father Bellini disappeared from the streets of Rome. He wasn't famous, he didn't hold high titles, but those who worked in the darker corners of the Vatican knew his name well. Some called him the Silent Priest, others whispered a different title, Rome's Last Vampire Hunter. Father Bellini was a Jesuit, trained not only in scriptures but also in ancient languages, forgotten rites, and lost texts. He had spent most of his life in the service of the Church, but never in the public eye. His assignments were secretive, his reports never shared with ordinary clergy. He worked alone, answering only to a few cardinals who oversaw special matters not spoken of in solemn celebrations. His work began in the years after World War I, when strange rumours began to circulate in Rome. Bodies found in locked rooms with no wounds, but completely bloodless, crypt doors wide open with no signs of forced entry, night watchmen in holy places who fell ill with fevers no doctor could identify. Most believed it was a disease or the aftermath of war, but the Vatican took no chances. Father Bellini was sent to investigate. His diary, recovered years later and sealed in the Vatican archives, tells the story in simple, careful words. He wrote about visits to churches at night, about checking ancient tombs for signs of disturbance. He spoke with custodians, monks, and nuns who whispered about pale shadows seen after dark. In one note, he described a hidden tunnel beneath a church near the Tiber. Inside was an ancient coffin, broken from within. Around it, on the walls, Latin prayers carved backward. Father Bellini was convinced that something had returned, not a demon, not a ghost, but something older. He wrote, "It walks like a man, but does not breathe. It drinks, but does not feed. It prays, but only to mock." The last entry in the diary is dated June 4th, 1922. He wrote that he had found the clue, that it led him to a private crypt beneath a desecrated chapel. He said he would enter that night, alone. The diary ends with these words, "If I do not return, seal it again. Do not open the door, not even for me." Father Bellini was never seen again. When, weeks later, Vatican workers visited the chapel, they found the crypt sealed from the inside. The air was heavy, remnants of ash lay on the stone floor, but there was no trace of Father Bellini. Only a wooden rosary, burned at the edges, and a drop of something red on the steps. Today, most people in Rome have never heard his name, but in certain rooms of the Vatican his file is still kept. It is brief, silent, and marked by a single Latin phrase, "Fidem tenuet usque ad finem." He kept the faith until the end. In the silent rooms of the Apostolic Palace, where the Pope rests every night, there is a small lamp that is never extinguished. It's not big or bright, just a faint glow in a corner of the room. Most people think it's for comfort or safety, but the tradition that accompanies it goes back many years, and its story is much more mysterious than expected. The custom began with Pope Clement IX in 1667. Before his time, popes often slept in total darkness like anyone else, but something happened during the second year of his pontificate, something never written in detail, but passed down in fragments and discreet notes. One night during Lent, the Pope was found sitting in bed, pale and shaken, unable to speak. The personal guard said they had heard no noise. The room was locked from the inside, but the pontiff's rosary lay broken on the floor, and 3 candles in the chapel next door had gone out without wind. The only document of the event is a handwritten letter from a counsellor of Clement. It said, "He was not alone, the room was locked, but something was watching him." That same night, a small oil lamp was placed beside his bed. Since then, it has never been extinguished. At first it was believed to be just a personal choice, but then the next pope, Innocent XV, also kept the same light burning, and so did the one who followed him. It became a silent tradition, never written in official documents, but passed down by private staff to each new pope. The room might change, the lamp might be replaced, but the light always stays on. In more recent years, a Vatican archivist found an old instruction hidden among the notes in the margin of a security manual for the Swiss guards. It said, "Under no circumstances should the papal lamp be turned off between sunset and sunrise." No reason was given. Some think the tradition comes from fear, not of the darkness itself, but of what the darkness might bring. There are stories most have forgotten, pale figures in the Vatican hallways after midnight, doorknobs slowly turning with no one there, and dreams shared by different popes, all with the same figure at the foot of the bed. Tall, silent, watching. A former papal assistant, speaking only after his retirement, said that when the light flickered one night, the Pope didn't sleep for 3 days, holding the Bible to his chest, praying constantly. The Vatican has never explained the tradition. They say it's just symbolic, a reminder of Christ's light in the darkness. But maybe, in those quiet rooms, the light isn't just comfort. Maybe it's a sign or a warning. There's an ancient prayer, whispered only in the darkest hours of the night. It's not written in any missal. You won't find it in liturgical books, hymns, or private prayer collections. And yet it has been spoken by certain priests at particular times, especially when fear grows and usual words seem too weak. This hidden prayer isn't for the ears of the people. It's said only in a low voice, sometimes during an exorcism, sometimes in front of a tomb that won't stay closed. It's never recited at Mass or repeated aloud during the day. Even its words sound strange, like a mix of Latin and something older, something lost. Its first mention appears in a letter dated to the early 17th century. A bishop from eastern Hungary wrote to Rome about a disturbing case. A man buried in consecrated ground was found outside his tomb 3 nights later. The body was untouched, with no signs of decay, and his eyes remained open. The towns were terrified. The bishop asked if the church had a special prayer for similar times, something beyond the usual rituals. He received no official answer, but months later a private messenger delivered a small sheet folded into 4 parts. On it were a few lines of Latin written in black ink, accompanied by a short note. "Use only if the soul does not leave. Do not speak to anyone present." That prayer has reappeared only a few times in history, always in mysterious cases. A sealed coffin that started to shake, a convent where, in a single night, all the mirrors were removed, a young seminarian who couldn't be photographed. The name of the prayer isn't known, but an archivist called it the breath of light. Its words don't ask for peace or mercy, but for protection from what walks in silence. They invoke the light of heaven to guard the living and imprison the breathless dead in an eternal stillness. In a record from 1871, a priest from the Transylvanian hills wrote in his diary that he had used it after a village refused to stay buried. He wrote, "I didn't understand the words, but I felt the air change as I spoke them. The shadows retreated. I lit a candle and it never went out again." The Church doesn't admit this prayer exists. No missal contains it. No modern priest is instructed to recite it. But in the private hallways of the Vatican, behind locked drawers and forgotten shelves, the old sheet still rests. And perhaps, somewhere tonight, in a dark room, where fear lingers and candles flicker without wind, a priest kneels and whispers words that shouldn't be remembered, words not written in any book, but that something ancient still hears. Not all orders of the Catholic Church wear bright robes or serve in open chapels. Some are called upon only in hushed tones, in rooms with thick curtains and doors locked from the inside. One of them is known as the Order of the Black Thorn. Officially, it doesn't exist. You won't find it among the Jesuits, Franciscans, or any recognized brotherhood, and yet its name appears in some hidden records, always linked to strange and unsettling events. The first sign of this order dates back to 1694, in a letter written by a cardinal to Rome. He spoke of a small group of silent trained watchers bound by thorns. He never explained what he meant by thorns, but the letter was filed among reserved documents, meant only for the Pope's eyes. Years later, a second reference appeared in the diary of a Jesuit sent to the Carpathians. He recounted that 3 men arrived unannounced, dressed in black, with small silver pins in the shape of a rose thorn. They came at night, spoke little, and left before dawn. Their mission, the Jesuit wrote, was not to preach or teach, but to hunt. Some say the Order of the Black Thorn was created at a time when the Church faced not only heresy, but an unnatural evil, creatures that looked human but weren't, essences that avoided daylight and couldn't be touched by ordinary prayers. While most priests guided souls, this secret order was formed to protect them from what lurked in the darkness. The chosen men were often former soldiers or scholars who had seen inexplicable things. They didn't take public vows, lived alone, or moved between monasteries, always under different names. When news arrived of towns where blood was found without wounds or corpses that didn't decay, they were sent in silence. A document from the Vatican archives, labelled only as Dark Case 11, tells of a chapel closed in 1752. It's said the last person seen entering was a man in black with a silver pin. The next day, the doors were sealed with holy oil and Mass was never celebrated there again. Over time, whispers of the order faded. By the late 19th century, many believed it had disappeared, but in 1931, during the cleaning of a small storage room in the Vatican, a wooden chest was found. Inside were 3 black robes, a rusty cross-shaped dagger, and a handwritten sheet in Latin. The note ended with the words, "The thorns protect the rose. The light must be guarded." No explanation was given. The chest was moved to a sealed archive. Whether the Order of the Black Thorn truly existed or still exists, no one can say for sure. But in certain dark corners of the church, where ancient fears still whisper among the stones, the thorn-shaped pin remains a symbol not just of faith, but of silent vigilance, of danger, and of those who descend into the shadows so others can sleep in peace. In the heart of Vatican City, among gardens and halls full of history, there's a corner of land that remains untouched. No statue stands there, no flowers grow. It's kept clean but empty, as if waiting for something that never arrived. Most visitors pass by without noticing it, but the older priests know its name. Whispered, the unblessed place. In the year 1786, plans were drawn for a new chapel right there. It was to be dedicated to Saint Michael the Archangel, the protector against evil. The designs were splendid, full of light and symbols of victory. The foundations were blessed, the first stones laid, and the workers began to raise the walls. But something changed before the work could be finished. A diary of the chief architect, found many years later, described a strange feeling in the place. He wrote that instruments disappeared during the night. Stones were found broken for no reason. Workers refused to return after dark. Some claimed to have heard soft voices coming from under the ground. Others said their dreams were filled with shadows walking through the halls even before the chapel was built. One morning the foreman found that all the crosses carved into the stone had been scraped off during the night. No guard saw anything. The work site was closed. A private investigation was conducted. No official report remains, but there's a letter from a cardinal to the Pope, marked urgent, that says only, "The visions continue." It's not the place. The building was never finished. The stones were silently removed. No new project was ever allowed on that land. A single olive tree was planted, but it withered in a week. Since then, the area remains as it is, open, watched, but never named. Some scholars have tried to find out more about the reasons for the suspension. Some recall stories of an ancient Roman temple buried under that land, a place of blood sacrifices long before the arrival of Christianity. Others believe the church found something during the excavations, something it chose not to explain. In a rare interview, a former Vatican gardener said he was ordered never to cross that space. He remembered his superior's warning, that land is not ours, let it rest. Even today, the Vatican doesn't mark that place on public maps. Guidebooks don't mention it. And yet, at night, the area is lit by a single lamp, always on, though no one tends it. The chapel of St. Michael was meant to be a place of strength and light, but something in that land didn't allow it. So, in a city full of sacred places, a small, unblessed space remains, as if the church chose silence instead of construction, stillness instead of prayer, and perhaps fear instead of faith. Among the fog-shrouded hills of northern Italy, there once existed an ancient monastery called San Aurelio, a quiet, remote place, far from the chaos of the city. In the autumn of 1944, however, the monks who lived there disappeared without a trace. No warning, no communication, just a deafening emptiness. When Vatican officials arrived at the site a few days later, they found a deserted monastery. Candles still burned on the altars, meals lay unfinished on the tables, but there were no footprints or signs of a struggle, only a forgotten diary on a wooden bench in the chapel. That diary belonged to Father Ernesto Raldi, an experienced exorcist, known for his quiet determination and unwavering faith. He had arrived at San Aurelio just weeks before the disappearance. The Vatican had heard reports of strange occurrences in the neighbouring village, residents mysteriously falling ill, farm animals found bloodless, and, even more disturbing, a young woman who returned from the dead. The diary was dirty, its leather cover marked by something dark. The ink on numerous pages was blurred by moisture or the passage of time. However, some entries remained decipherable. The first pages recount Father Raldi's journey to the monastery, his prayers, and his conviction that the voices were just terror and superstition. But from the third day, the record changed in tone. He wrote about sleepless nights and icy draughts with no source. He described birds found lifeless in front of the chapel entrances, eyes wide open, wings spread as if frozen in the air. He began to hear noises beneath the stone floor, scratches like nails on the rocky surface. On the sixth night, the brothers informed him that they had seen someone wandering the courtyard, a tall, pale, emaciated figure, dressed in clothes from distant eras. No one could say where it had gone, no open doors, no footprints detected. Father Raldi decided to perform a purification ritual. He fasted, prayed, and prepared the sacred objects, but the last entry is the one that chills the blood. It says, "Now I understand that the soul I came to redeem is not lost, but imprisoned. It wears the body like a mask, but the light cannot penetrate it. I begin the rite tonight. If I write no more, may God finish what I cannot." The following pages are blank. The monastery was sealed after the diary was found, and the Vatican decreed that no one else should enter there. That diary today lies locked in an armoured drawer in the Vatican archives. Inside the cover is a small note recovered in San Aurelio. No survivors, do not replicate. There are those who claim Father Raldi failed that night. Others believe he succeeded, but at a terrible price. Whatever the reality, hidden within those pages, one thing seems clear. Something was present, and something refused to leave. At the heart of Catholic doctrine, burial in consecrated ground represents the final act of peace. It means the soul finds rest, that the body sleeps under the protection of the Church, but occasionally someone is buried outside that safeguard, not for transgression, not by statute, but because something, in death, caused disturbance, even to the Church. There are hidden records filed in the Vatican archives, not many, just a few cases spread across the centuries, where high-ranking clergy members, Bishops, monks, even cardinals were denied burial in consecrated ground with no clear reason ever written. The documents only state, by special provision, that the burial should not take place in blessed ground. One of these episodes occurred in the year 1847. A cardinal named Lorenzo Danti died suddenly in Rome. There was no illness or attack, just silence. The day before, the cardinal had been seen calmly walking through the gardens of the Apostolic Palace. But the next morning, when his servant entered the room, the cardinal had disappeared, the bed immaculate, the clothes neatly folded on the chair. Hours later, the body was discovered lying on the altar of a closed chapel with wide, staring eyes, lips stained, dark. An autopsy was performed, but the results were never released. The only information the Church released was that Cardinal Danti would not be buried in Vatican soil. His body was transported to a distant monastery, buried in a stone crypt with no inscription on the tomb. Another episode occurred in 1906. An esteemed Jesuit, Father Thomas Wysek, died in Poland under enigmatic circumstances. He had dedicated years to studying ancient texts on heresies and evil spirits. In recent times he had isolated himself in silence, refused visitors, and covered all the mirrors in his room. When he passed away, his room was full of crosses, but none facing upwards. All were mysteriously inverted. The Church sent a group to bless the place, but his body was never taken to the cathedral. He was secretly buried in the forest, under an unmarked stone with only a number on it. The pattern is always the same. Unusual deaths, no clear explanation, and a burial far from holy ground. Some believe these rites are done as a precaution, as if the Church feared something might stay tied to the body, something not yet ready to leave. Others think it's a silent punishment, a way to bury certain truths with the dead. But one detail keeps showing up in almost all these stories: a small vial of holy oil, placed next to the body, not to bless it, but to seal it. Because while most people rest peacefully, some are buried separately, not to honour them, but to protect us. In the winter of 1927, in the French Alps, a group of travellers got lost in a snowstorm. As they tried to reach a village, the mountains were silent that night. The wind howled through the pine trees, the moon hidden by thick clouds. Cold and tired, they took shelter in a small hunting cabin at the edge of the forest. But what they saw after midnight would stay with them forever. There were 6 people, 2 farmers, a teacher, and 3 siblings travelling to visit family. At first, they heard nothing but the wind, then the sound of light footsteps in the snow. It wasn't animals, it wasn't boots, it was a steady rhythm, like a procession. They looked out the window and saw lights in the darkness, dozens of small flames slowly moving down the hillside. The lights came closer, and they saw them, figures dressed in long black robes, hoods pulled low over their faces. They walked in pairs, holding candles that didn't flicker in the wind. No one made a sound. No one turned their head. They moved in silence, like shadows gliding over the snow. In the middle of the procession was something even more unsettling. 4 hooded figures carried a coffin, plain and dark, with no markings. The travellers watched, frozen between terror and wonder, as the procession passed the cabin and disappeared into the forest. In the morning, the men followed the tracks left in the snow, but after a few feet they stopped. Not erased, not covered, just ended, as if the whole procession had vanished into thin air. When they reached the nearest village, they told the priest everything. He listened without interrupting. Then he quietly begged them never to speak of it again. One of the siblings disagreed. He wrote a letter to the bishop describing every detail. That letter now sits in a Vatican file marked Dark Case 17. Years later, a Vatican scholar re-examined the case and made a surprising discovery. An almost identical event had been recorded in a monastic diary from 1143, also in that case, in the Alps, also in winter. also a silent procession with an unmarked coffin. No one knows what that group was doing or where they came from, but some believe it was part of an ancient rite hidden from the church's eyes, a ritual to bury something or someone far from holy ground. Others believe that procession wasn't made up of living people. Whatever the truth, the travellers never forgot that night. One of them, now an old man, was asked about it one day. He thought it had just been a dream. He simply replied, "Dreams don't leave tracks in the snow." In the city of Avignon, in the late 15th century, there lived a child who seemed to never grow. His skin was pale, like wax, his eyes a deep grey, and his voice barely louder than a whisper. The townspeople called him Quiet Lagasson, the silent child. He lived in a stone house by the old Roman walls, with an elderly couple who claimed to have found him one winter morning on their doorstep, wrapped in snow. At first they thought he was sick. He ate almost nothing, just a few spoonfuls of broth or water. But as the months passed, the child didn't grow, didn't change. After 5 winters, he was the same as the day he arrived. The church started to take notice when the local priest visited the house. In his notes, he wrote that the child's presence made candles flicker and the air grow cold, even without wind. During a blessing, he never looked at the crucifix. When offered communion, he held it in his mouth without swallowing. Even more unsettling, no animal would go near him. The family dog barked every time he entered the room. Birds avoided the house. Cats disappeared. One morning, the couple said they found him in the garden just before dawn, barefoot on the ice, still not shivering. When they tried to bring him inside, the child growled, showing teeth too sharp for his age. From that day on, the old couple locked their doors at night and wrote to the bishop. The bishop's envoys arrived in silence, dressed in dark robes, and asked no questions. They spoke with the couple, inspected the house, and finally went to the child. What happened in that meeting was never documented, but afterward the child was taken to a nearby monastery for examination. He stayed there only 3 nights. On the 4th morning, the monks found his bed empty. The doors were locked, the windows sealed, and yet the child had vanished. In his place, the sheets were soaked red, and carved into the headboard was "Non Moria, I do not die." The Vatican sent investigators, but the records from that time were sealed. Only 2 pages remain, faded and full of notes. One note reads, "The subject does not rest. Avoid mirrors, keep prayers silent." After that, no one in Avignon ever saw the child again. The couple who had taken him in moved away. The house fell into ruin and later burned down for no known reason. Some say that even today the child walks the streets at dawn, looking the same as he did centuries ago. Others believe the church has buried the truth in its archives, too afraid to admit what it had seen. But sometimes, just before dawn, an old man in Avignon still leaves a bowl of water on his doorstep, just in case the pale child returns. In the dark forests of Transylvania, long before they became famous for legends of the undead, there was a small stone church dedicated to a forgotten saint. He was called Saint Listat of the Klugs, and was known as the guardian of the sick and the frightened. Travellers lit candles in his shrine, and villagers whispered his name during storms or epidemics. Today, however, no one mentions him. No celebrations, no statues, no official memory, as if the church had completely erased him. The only known document about St. Listat is in a handwritten book found in the archives of a Hungarian monastery. Written by a monk named Friar Martino, it describes a visit to the village of Cluj in 1184. Friar Martino writes of a wonderful chapel with colourful stained glass windows showing a tall figure holding a lantern guiding people at night. The inhabitants said that this was Saint Lista, who lived among them in a time of great fear. He arrived during a plague, never got sick, not even touching the ill. Some claimed he healed the dying with a single touch, Others said he knew who would live and who wouldn't, just by looking into their eyes. He was quiet, silent, and never seemed to rest. To Friar Martino this seemed curious, but not unsettling. What troubled him was how the villagers reacted when he asked about the saint's death. Their answers were brief. Some looked away. One man crossed himself and only said that he had not been buried in the church. Later in the diary, Friar Martino recounts visiting the shrine. He found no bones or relics, only a stone engraved with a strange symbol, neither a cross nor a holy sign. That night he dreamed of a voice calling him from the forest, low and sweet, asking to be remembered. When he woke up, the chapel doors were wide open. The church never officially recognized Saint Listar. In fact, 10 years after Friar Martino's visit, all traces of that saint were removed. The chapel was dismantled stone by stone, the icons burned, the inhabitants were forbidden to utter his name. A letter from a bishop reads, "This one does not belong in the calendar of the blessed, cancel him for safety." The reasons remain unclear. Some believe he was never truly a saint, that the church had discovered something unnatural about him. Others think he was too close to local beliefs, half man and half spirit, more guardian than man of faith. But even today, in the forests where the chapel once stood, it is said that the air is colder, and sometimes just before dawn, a faint light appears among the trees, a lantern carried by someone who was once honoured and then forgotten. In the spring of 1856, something happened in Rome that no one could explain. For 3 days and 3 nights, the city's bells stopped ringing. No church rang its bronze, not even the great bell of St. Peter's. Silence descended upon the city like a thick fog, weighing on every street, every house, every heart. At first, people thought it was a malfunction, a broken mechanism, perhaps bad weather, but the sky was clear, the air still. And yet the bell towers remained silent. No priest rang them, no hand pulled the ropes. Even more unsettling, when a priest tried to move the bells manually, nothing happened. The ropes moved, but the bells made no sound. The first day the city was uneasy. The second day fear began to spread. Market stalls closed early, shops locked their doors. People whispered of omens and signs, wondering if something terrible had arrived in Rome without warning. But it was the third night that was the most frightening. A nun from a small convent near the Tiber wrote in her diary that she heard a soft singing outside her window. Shortly after midnight, when she looked out, no one was there, but the shadows on the wall seemed to move without light. She stayed awake until morning, praying without ceasing. In the Vatican, guards reported strange events. One said that the candles in the papal chapel would not stay lit, no matter how many times he struck the match. Another swore he saw a pale figure cross the courtyard, even though the doors were locked and no one should have been outside. A letter, found many years later in the archives, speaks of a secret meeting between several cardinals and the Holy Father on the second night. The topic is unknown, but the letter ends with a chilling phrase: "We must not speak his name, only seal the door again am I." No public explanation was ever given. On the fourth morning the bells returned as if nothing had happened. People came out, blinking in the sunlight, unsure if what they had experienced was real or not. The Vatican issued a brief message talking about maintenance, but people didn't believe it. Not after what they had heard, not after what they had seen. As the years passed, the story of those 3 days faded, but those who lived through them did not forget. Some still whisper that something had risen beneath Rome, something that silenced even the sacred bells. And during those 3 days in 1856, the eternal city held its breath, as if listening for footsteps that should not have been heard. In the early 19th century, a cardinal named Benedetto Carvani lived in Rome. He was known for his sharp mind, his insightful sermons, and his deep knowledge of canon law. But behind closed doors he was famous for something much stranger. He didn't rest in a bed, he rested in a coffin. The story first came from a servant, a discreet man who had worked in the cardinal's residence for over 10 years. One night, carrying clean clothes to the guest rooms, he passed the private room and noticed the door ajar. Inside, by the light of a single candle, he saw the cardinal lying in a dark wooden box lined with red velvet. At first he said nothing, believing it was a mistake, but when it happened again and again, he began to fear. The rumour finally reached the other church officials, but few believed it. They said Cardinal Carvani was eccentric, not crazy. But when the Pope himself made a quiet visit one night, the truth became impossible to deny. The coffin was real. When asked for an explanation, the Cardinal calmly replied, "We must rest as we will rise." He said it was a personal reminder of death and faith, that each night, as he lay in the coffin, he prayed for restless souls, those who found no peace in the grave. But some believed there was another reason. An old diary, found years later in the Vatican archives, hinted at strange events during Carvani's early life. As a young priest, he had served in a remote village in Croatia, where mysterious deaths occurred, cattle bled dry, graves desecrated, a child buried 3 times. The young priest stayed for months and returned to Rome transformed, quieter, paler. Some nights the cardinal did not eat, drank only wine, and touched no food. He refused mirrors in his room and ordered all reflective surfaces removed. Servants claimed his room was always cold, even in midsummer. Despite the rumours, Carvani remained in good standing with the church, celebrated Mass, preached long and wise sermons, and was loved by the people, but no one was allowed in his quarters at night. He died peacefully in the winter of 1832. The Vatican arranged a private funeral, and his coffin, yes, the same one, was sealed and placed in a crypt beneath St. Peter's Basilica. But something was unusual about his tomb. After the burial, a second blessing was performed, and a silver cross was nailed to the lid. When asked why, the bishop present simply replied, "He asked for it." Even today, the story of the cardinal who rested in a coffin is one of Rome's most whispered tales. Was it just a man's reminder of faith and death? Or a silent protection in case sleep wasn't enough to keep something darker at bay? In the heart of Vatican City, within the oldest bell tower, near St. Peter's Basilica, something strange began to happen in the late 19th century every evening at sunset. A cloud of bats emerged from the bell tower, darkening the sky for a moment before dissolving into the Roman night. There were hundreds, perhaps more. The inhabitants had begun to call it the Black Hour. But what made it truly strange was not the presence of the bats. They only showed up there. No other tower in Rome, no nearby churches, no ancient ruins housed bats. No tree, no cave, no barn, just the Vatican bell tower, and always at the same time, as if following a secret calendar. At first the church said nothing. Bats, after all, weren't rare in old cities. But as the years passed, priests started talking about strange things. Bell ropes worn out in a single night, without being rung. Wax candles near the tower melting without heat. And once, during a full moon, the bells rang 3 times on their own, even though no one had gone up. In 1904, rumours began to spread that the bats weren't just animals, but signs, warnings. Some monks refused to ring the bells, claiming the creatures watched them from the rafters with eyes that seemed too human. A report from a Vatican custodian in 1921 tells of a night when the bats didn't come out. For the first time in almost 40 years, the sky above the bell tower remained empty. The next morning, the body of a stray dog was found at the foot of the tower. Not a drop of blood, no wounds, no signs at all. The next night, the bats returned. Pope Pius X secretly ordered an investigation. Experts were secretly called to observe. They noticed that the bats avoided holy water and didn't show the expected reactions to light or noise. Someone tried to capture one for study, but every attempt failed. Cages opened on their own, traps were sprung in vain. Then, during a spring in 1933, the bats suddenly disappeared. Just as they had arrived, they left no corpses, no indication of migration. The sky remained deserted for weeks, then for whole months. Never again did a bat return to that Vatican tower. For some it was a relief, others felt uneasy, as if something had been watching for a long time before deciding to leave. The bell tower was cleaned, restored, and reopened to visitors, and yet, even today, no bat has returned, not a single one. According to some, they weren't bats at all, but that the tower hid something ancient, something that needed darkness to hide itself. And when it left, it also took the darkness with it. Now, when the bells ring out on quiet Vatican nights, no flapping is heard above them, only stillness and the memory of that dark hour. On a rocky spur in southern Italy stood the Priory of San Vito, a small stone convent surrounded by olive trees and wild rosemary. From a distance it looked peaceful, its ancient sturdy walls and the bell tower emerging from the trees had for centuries protected a place of silent prayer. But in the spring of 1771, everything changed. It started with the silence. Letters stopped arriving from the priory. Passers-by noticed no smoke coming from the chimneys. The bell, which had resonated every evening at sunset, fell silent. Initially, it was thought that the religious were on a spiritual retreat, but then a shepherd whose flock grazed at the foot of the hill saw something that chilled his soul. He reported to the parish priest that he had looked up at the monastery at dusk and had seen motionless figures on the roof, not one or two, but many. They wore dark clothes, their faces hidden. They didn't move even when the wind struck the stones. The alarmed parish priest informed the bishop, who sent 2 men to investigate. Upon arriving at the priory, they found the massive gates open. Inside, everything was in place. Consumed candles, half-eaten food, books left open on the altar, but no people, not a single monk. Then they discovered the library. It had been locked from the inside. When they forced the lock, they found every page of every volume torn out and burned in a pile in the centre of the room. On the walls, traced in red ink, appeared a message in Latin. They came at midnight. We are not alone. No bodies were ever found. The Vatican immediately took control of the priory. A group of priests arrived within days, sealing the place and removing every document. None of these were ever released, but an elderly archivist said that a thin file remains in the archives, marked with a single word, sanctum. According to tradition, one of the monks had found a relic hidden under the chapel floor, an ancient wooden box, sealed with iron nails and wrapped in faded fabric. Inside, something peculiar. Some speak of a scroll written in an incomprehensible language, others of a bone fragment engraved with tiny symbols. Whatever it was, the monks tried to destroy it, and that's when the silence began. Today the Priory of San Vito remains forbidden to the public. Its stone walls are covered with moss and thorns, and no new priest has ever been assigned there. Passers-by at dusk continue to look up at the roof, cautiously scanning, because sometimes, they say, the figures reappear, motionless, waiting, hidden in a silent corner of the Vatican museums under layers of dust and forgotten names. Once lay a small velvet box, no bigger than a loaf of bread. It was kept in a drawer, behind locked glass, away from visitors, with no label, no description, no explanation whatsoever. Only a hand-written note in faded ink read, "Do not expose to sunlight." The box arrived at the Vatican in 1892. It came from a ruined monastery in northern Romania, sealed in a wooden box lined with salt and wool. A Jesuit, Father Alessio, had sent it with a brief message. Artifact recovered, shows signs of anomalous heat, possible connection to Dark File 12. When the box was first opened in Rome, A faint scent of burnt wood filled the air. Inside was a single object, an iron pendant in the shape of a circle with a jagged line in the middle. At first glance it looked simple, almost like a child's etching, but under candlelight its surface trembled as if it were moving. Father Alessio warned the custodians never to expose it to sunlight, but a young assistant decided to check. The next morning he placed it near an open window. In a few moments, the paper it rested on began to smoke. Not just heat, it was burning. When he touched the pendant, his fingers were so burned that he couldn't hold a pen for weeks. The object's fame quickly spread in certain Vatican hallways, especially among those who studied ancient texts and forbidden relics. One theory held that the pendant was connected to a medieval legend about the sunborn seal, an object used to mark those who had risen from the dead without God's grace. Another claimed it came from a secretly open tomb, a sepulchre older than the church itself, but no one knew for sure what it was or what it could do. In the early 20th century, the pendant was moved to the underground archives, placed in a lid box, and stored on a shelf marked sensitive. It remained there for decades, untouched. Then, in 1971, during a routine inspection, a researcher opened it for the first time in years. He wore gloves, used dim light, respected all the rules, and yet, as soon as the pendant was uncovered, the glass in the room began to fog up. Later, he wrote that he had felt observed despite being alone. He closed the box again and asked that it never be opened again. Today, the pendant is still somewhere beneath the Vatican. No photographs exist, no visitor can approach it, but those who have studied it claim it fears not darkness, but light, because some things burn not from fire, but from truth. In a hidden corner of an ancient Roman basilica, behind an iron gate and down a narrow staircase, lies a tomb no one can access. The stone above the arch reads only Sanctus Ex. No full name, no date, no symbol of peace or hope, just a warning engraved on the gate in Latin. Do not awaken. The tomb of Sandex doesn't appear on tourist maps. Even many priests are unaware of its existence, but those who work deep within the sacred spaces of the Vatican have heard his name whispered, often followed by silence or the sign of the cross. What makes this tomb feared is not what surrounds it, but what might be inside. According to a sealed report from the early 18th century, the church once publicly revered him. His image appeared on small prints, and his story was told in secluded chapels. He was said to be a holy man who walked alone through the valleys of Eastern Europe, healing the sick and bringing light to dark villages. But over time, the story changed. Some claimed he didn't heal, but made people sick, that he didn't drink wine or eat, and that he only appeared at night. Villages left offerings at their doors to keep him away, not to welcome him. And yet the church transported his body to Rome. It was placed in a special tomb under one of the oldest churches, sealed with oil and iron nails. Initially pilgrims came to pray, but then strange things began to happen. Candles near the crypt wouldn't stay lit, statues wept or bowed. An intense cold filled the chapel, even in midsummer. A deacon spent a night near the tomb as penance. In the morning he was found pale and trembling, unable to speak for days. He soon left the church and never returned to Rome. After that episode, the Vatican closed the lower level and sealed the gate with 3 keys, each entrusted to a different official. All images of Sandex were removed, his feast day cancelled from the calendar, his name removed from the Book of Saints. Today, only a few scholars remember that he existed, but the tomb remains. Guards still pass by it at night, without stopping, and once a year, on the eve of a long-forgotten feast day, a priest is sent alone to the basilica to recite a silent prayer before the gate. No one explains why, no one speaks the name. Only the warning remains: do not awaken. The Swiss Guard is famous for its colourful uniforms, its quiet strength, its loyalty to the Pope. They stand like statues at the gates of the Vatican, watchful and still. But there's an aspect of their duty that's rarely discussed, even in training. A task passed down in whispers, never written in any manual. It concerns a place deep beneath the Vatican, where few have been, and even fewer wish to go. They simply call it the Lower Guard. In the dark hours of the night, when the city sleeps and the bells have stopped ringing, a guard is chosen to walk the oldest path, beneath St. Peter's Basilica. This path descends into the catacombs past ancient tombs and ruined walls to a massive black wooden door, sealed with iron rings. The guard never enters. No one enters. Their task is only to watch. Many new soldiers believe the story is just a tradition, something veterans made up to scare them. But when it's time for the lower shift, the laughter fades. In front of that door, they realise something isn't normal. The air is always freezing, no matter the season. The light from their flashlights seems to dim right there. Some say they hear whispers beyond the wall, slow and muffled, in an unknown language. A retired former guard once told of seeing the door move, as if something inside had shifted in its sleep. The Vatican has never confirmed what lies beyond. Some believe it's just an empty crypt. Others think it guards something older than the church itself, something that cannot die, but only rest. In 1962, a guard disappeared during the lower shift. His name was Otto Weiss. A reserved man with 6 years of impeccable service, he was last seen at midnight, descending the steps. In the morning, the gate was still closed, the door intact, but Otto was gone. No sign of a struggle, no letter, just his uniform, neatly folded near the inner wall of the basilica. From that day on, the rules changed. 2 guards would watch together, one in front of the door, the other further up, beyond the stairs. And yet, the silence persists. No one can talk about what they see on the lower shift. Not to friends, not to family, not even to the Pope. Those who try often stop mid-sentence, as if the memory itself refuses to be recalled. And yet, every night, without exception, a guard walks that old path, stops alone before the black door, listens to the stillness, and never speaks of it again. In 1591, a mysterious letter arrived at the Vatican. It wasn't delivered through the usual channels, but by a traveller in dark clothes who didn't give his name. He handed it to a priest outside the apostolic palace and left without a word. The envelope was sealed with black wax and marked only with the letter V. Initially, it was set aside. The Vatican received many strange messages, almost always forgotten. But when a scholar opened it, what he read prompted him to keep it in the archives. It began, "To His Holiness, Bishop of Rome, Guardian of the living light, I write not as a threat, but as truth, for I am no longer what I was." The author claimed to be over 200 years old. He gave no name, only stories. He spoke of forests where he had hidden, of wars he had lived through, of cities he had seen rise and fall. He described waking each night with a hunger he couldn't ignore, and a fear of light so deep that even the moon hurt him. But the most terrifying part was towards the end. "I was a priest, one of yours. I believed, I prayed, but when the sickness came, I was struck, transformed. I died, but I did not stay dead. I rose with blood on my lips, and the name of God still in my heart." He spoke of fighting the urge, of seeking refuge in sacred places, of standing outside churches, never able to enter. "They burn," he wrote, "but I still try." He said he didn't want to cause harm, but only to rest. No one knows if the letter was authentic or the work of a madman. What disturbed the church most wasn't just the words, but the ink. Later analysis showed it wasn't ink at all, but dried blood. Some scholars thought it was a hoax, a trick to scare people, but others weren't so sure. The descriptions matched ancient legends from Eastern Europe. Stories of Strigoi, Nosferatu, the Pale Ones. tales the church had tried to bury. The letter was never answered. It was put away in a sealed drawer in the Apostolic Archive, filed as unusual correspondence. Only a few have read it since, but the drawer stays closed, and with it the black seal, preserved on a piece of waxed cloth. To this day, centuries later, the Church refuses to talk about it. There are some who believe the sender still walks the earth. Others wonder if that letter wasn't a threat but a prayer, the last cry of something that had once been a man, a plea to the Church for help, forgiveness, or to be stopped. Beneath the Vatican stretches the Apostolic Archive, full of old texts, secret letters, forgotten records. Long stone corridors go down deep, lined with heavy, numbered, locked doors. Most visitors, even trusted scholars, only get to see a tiny part. But among the older guardians and librarians, there's a rumour of a door not on any map. A door without a number, or rather, with a number almost no one dares to say. The 13th door. They say it's at the end of a narrow hallway, hidden behind a false wall. To get to it, you have to go down 13 steps from the main archive room and pass through a gate that's almost always sealed. Those who have seen it describe it as blackened by time, the wood warped, the hinges swollen with rust. No inscription, no lock, just a number carved into the stone. 13. What it holds behind it is still a mystery. One story tells of a young archivist, Matteo, who found it in 1938. He was organising old maps when he noticed a draft coming from a wall that should have been solid. When he pushed, the panel moved, showing the hidden staircase. He went down it until he reached the door. Driven by curiosity, he reached out, but as soon as his fingers touched the wood, he collapsed to the floor. When they found him, he was still alive, but shaking and unable to speak. Later, he left the Vatican and was never seen again. Over the years, others have looked for that door. Some find nothing, others say they see it for just a moment before it disappears like a mirage. One guard swore the door was real, but it had no doorknob. He said he heard a faint tapping from the other side. 3 knocks, slow and steady, but when he opened his eyes again, the hallway was empty. The Church has never confirmed the door's existence. No official document talks about a 13th door, and the archive maps jump straight from 12 to 14. But why? In ancient times, the number 13 was seen as bad luck. In some early Christian traditions, it was linked to betrayal, suffering, to what should stay hidden. Maybe that door was sealed centuries ago to lock something inside, or to keep others away. A voice from the last century claims the door was last opened during World War II, when a cardinal ordered a secret inspection of the archives. The report of that visit was burned, and the cardinal resigned shortly after, citing health reasons. Today, the 13th door is just a whisper among those who walk the deepest corridors of the Vatican. It doesn't appear in any plans, it's never mentioned in meetings, but some say that if you stay silent in the dead of night, in the lowest rooms of the archives, you can still feel it close by, waiting. Hidden within the walls of Vatican City, there's also a small guest house. It's only used for visiting clergy and trusted scholars. It's not big or fancy, but the rooms are neat and quiet, with small beds, wooden desks, and tall windows that let in the soft light of Rome. Each room has a number above the door. 1, 2, 3, up to 10. But anyone who stays there soon notices something strange. Room number 7 is always empty. The door stays closed. The lights never come on. The staff skip it without saying anything. No name is listed on the sheet next to that room, and if anyone asks, the answer is simply that room 7 isn't in use, but it wasn't always like that. In the spring of 1959, a French bishop named Henri Mauron was staying at the guest house. He had been to the Vatican many times before and usually stayed in room 3, but that time all the rooms were full except for 7. They gave him the key. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual. The room was small but tidy. A simple crucifix hung on the wall, a Bible on the nightstand. The bishop left his bags and went to evening mass, but the next morning something had changed. At breakfast he looked pale and quiet. He didn't touch his food. When asked if he had slept well, he just nodded. That night he went back to his room and locked the door. The next morning he was gone. His personal belongings were still there, the bed untouched, his shoes neatly by the wall, but the bishop had vanished without a trace. No one saw him leave. No one heard a sound. The Vatican searched the entire guest house, every hallway, every staircase, even the roof. They never found him. From that day on, room 7 was closed. The staff were told not to talk about it. The official report said the bishop had fallen ill and returned to France, but no one in his country ever confirmed that story. His name slowly disappeared from the records. As time went on, guests in the neighbouring rooms started whispering among themselves, talking about a chilling draught that crept under the door, of faint knocks that echoed in the darkest hours. One visitor, a priest from Argentina, claimed with certainty to have heard Latin prayers coming from the wall, even though the room was empty. Finally, in 1972, the Vatican permanently sealed room number 7. A small, sacred symbol was placed at the entrance, and the key was put away in a cabinet. Even today, the guest house still operates, quiet, well-kept, serene, but room 7 remains in darkness. There are those who say it's just a room. Others believe it's something different, an atmosphere the church can't understand, a space that holds the memory of what humans have erased. In the silent passages of the Vatican galleries, where centuries-old artworks cover the surfaces and gilded structures gleam under dim lighting, there was once a painting on display that is no longer there. It wasn't famous, and no inscription said who made it, but those who saw it couldn't forget it. It was called The Lifeless Portrait. It showed a lonely man, wrapped in a long dark robe with a silver symbol hanging from his chest. His face was faded, almost ash-coloured, and his gaze seemed to follow you everywhere. But this wasn't the most disturbing thing. It was what was behind the man, a large reflective surface. And in that surface, there was no reflection. You could see the wall behind him, the floor, the glow of flames, but not the man. Art experts examined it and decided it was just a stylistic choice. The artist had chosen to leave out the reflection, probably to convey an idea or create mystery, but others, looking at that painting, felt a deeper chill, as if that painted surface held something more. In 1934, a young museum attendant named Luca noticed that visitors would suddenly fall silent in front of the portrait. Some would back away, others would stare too intently, as if in a trance. One lady unexpectedly fainted, later saying she felt as if a limb had reached out from the surface to grab her. The Vatican arranged for the artwork to be removed. Initially, it was placed in a secondary space with other minor creations, but the strange happenings continued. The room's lighting would flicker for no reason. Cameras would stop working. A guard reported hearing movements at night, only to find the room empty, except for the portrait inexplicably overturned on the floor with its front facing down. It was then moved again, this time to the underground spaces where very few people can go. For many years it was forgotten. Later, in 1983, a scholar, re-examining old files, found a document that recorded the artwork's arrival from a humble Austrian church, and it had been donated in the late 19th century. The donor was unknown, but inside the packaging, along with the artwork, was a concise message written in Latin: "Keep it where it cannot be seen." What did it mean? No one really understands. Some believe the man in the portrait had really existed, that he had once walked among us, hidden in the darkness until the reflective surface revealed him. Others think it's just a story made bigger by fear and the passage of time. but the artwork still lies in the Vatican depths, locked in a metal container, away from the light, and anyone who has stood before it invariably says the same thing. The air grows colder, the gaze never closes, and the reflective surface, eternally without images, waits. In the most distant section of the ancient Vatican library, there is a volume bound in worn leather that very few have examined. The pages, delicate and marked by centuries, have a title that is almost unreadable. Inside, in fine Latin, it describes the details of a forgotten ceremony, a practice once performed by the Church. It was called Purificio Sanguinis, the purification of sacred blood. For about 2 centuries, this strange ceremony was secretly performed by a small group of religious figures. It wasn't in the canonical rules, no sermon mentioned it, and no one outside the Vatican knew it existed. The ceremony was never performed during the day. It was done in secret, by firelight, in crypts under churches or in hidden rooms in convents. Its purpose, according to the volume, was to remove the impure touch from sacred vessels, but over time the meaning seemed to change. A document from 1765 describes a ceremony where a chalice previously used in Mass was buried in salt, covered in ash, and enclosed in a stone box. The religious person wrote, "The vessel showed signs of contamination not from human beings, but from what walks in their shadow." Another document from 1810 tells of a sacred cloth that refused to dry after communion. The same ceremony was applied, and later the fabric was burned. Even though it bore the sign of Christ, this went against all tradition. But the religious person noted, it must be removed. Remember, what was the Church afraid of? Some believed the ceremony was meant to purify objects touched by evil, perhaps something worse than sin. The words in the volume hint at creatures drawn to blood not out of devotion but out of hunger. The language is careful, never the word vampire, never demon, but it speaks of the pale ones, of false religious figures, and of those who drink beneath the altar. By the late 18th century, records of this ceremony decreased, fewer and fewer notes were left. The last mention appears in an anonymous letter from 1792. We no longer perform the ceremony. Silence is more protective. Afterwards, the volume was put away. No one talks about Purificio Sanguinis anymore. It has disappeared from ecclesiastical training. New religious figures have never heard its name. And yet the volume remains on its shelf, hidden behind rows of more harmless texts. The leather cover is cracked, the corners torn, but the pages are warm to the touch, and if you listen closely while reading, some claim you can hear a soft chant, like the memory of a prayer the Church has tried to forget, a ceremony not made to bless, but to defend. In the quiet rooms of the Vatican Museum of Curiosities, a particular object was once kept in a glass display case. It had no clear description or place in any formal catalogue. Most visitors walked past it without noticing, but those who looked closely sensed something strange. It wasn't a relic, nor an instrument, nor a statue. It was a stake carved from solid ivory, polished and clear, with a sharp point. Around the handle were faded engraved symbols, some Latin, others older, hard to identify. It lay on red velvet, under dim light, with a small bronze plaque that simply said, "Do not touch." The stake was kept in a remote corner of the museum, near other strange and forgotten objects. A volume that couldn't be opened, a mirror with its glass turned backward, a container of dust from a chapel now lost. No one knows when the stake first arrived. Some believe it came from the Carpathians, sent by a Jesuit missionary in the 18th century. Others think it was part of an older collection, gathered during the Church's silent battle against heresy and terror. A retired archivist claimed the stake had been used in a real ceremony, never described in modern texts, meant to stop what could not be buried. In 1974, a group of researchers asked to examine it closely. Permission was granted, but only during nighttime hours. When the display case was opened, the room grew colder, even though the windows were closed. One of the researchers touched the ivory with his fingertip and immediately pulled his hand back, claiming it burned like fire. The museum staff immediately closed the display case. A few months later, the stake was gone. The official story was that it had been moved for preservation, stored away from time and light, but no one ever saw it again. In the display case, only a simple crucifix remained. The plaque was gone. Some people believe the stake is hidden deep in the Vatican's vaults, away from prying eyes. Others say it shouldn't have been displayed in the first place, and its presence in the museum was a mistake. But there's a quieter theory, that the stake wasn't just a reminder of what had been, but a tool still meant to be used, not against myths or legends, but against something the Church still fears. And maybe, when the night grows long and the silence too deep, someone within those ancient walls still knows where it is, waiting. In the low, quiet halls of the Vatican Library, hidden beneath layers of volumes and marble, there's a passage few know about. At the end, past a locked gate and behind a wooden door, is a room completely lined with mirrors. The floor, the walls, even the ceiling. Every surface reflects, light bounces in strange ways, and when you enter, your own image seems to multiply endlessly, as if you're being watched from every angle. It's called the Room of Mirrors, its purpose long forgotten. Some say it was used by scholars to study light and reflections. Others believe it had a more spiritual purpose, perhaps to reflect the soul back on itself. But after 1961, the room was closed, and no one has entered it since. That year, Monsignor Anselmo disappeared. He was a quiet man, known for his deep study of scriptures and his calm demeanour. He had come to the Vatican to examine a rare parchment kept in the oldest archives. One morning he signed in at the guard post as usual, then went down the spiral staircase to the rooms of the oldest collection. He never returned. At first, no one worried. Scholars often got lost for hours among the volumes and dust, but when night fell and he still hadn't come out, the search began. His coat was still in the reading room, his bag next to his chair, but there was no trace of him. Security records showed no exit. That same night, a cleaning attendant claimed to have heard movement coming from the Room of Mirrors. But when the guards went to check, they found the door ajar and the lights flickering. Inside, there was no one, except for something unsettling. In the reflection of a mirror, a still silhouette appeared by the wall, but when they turned, there was nothing, only the reflection. Then, slowly, it too faded, leaving an empty room and a cold draught that shouldn't have been there. The Vatican closed the room the next day. Official records declare Anselmo missing, presumed deceased, but his body was never found. No sign of a struggle, no farewell letter, just his silent absence and a passage no one walks anymore. The mirrors weren't removed, they remain there, now covered by heavy black cloths nailed to the walls. But even so, some guards refuse to go near, saying the mirrors can hold more than a reflection, saying the bishop never left, and that, on certain nights, when the passage is silent and the light fades, a faint silhouette still appears in the glass, waiting. Among the many sacred texts guarded in the vast Vatican libraries, the Book of Psalms is one of the oldest and most studied. Its prayers, songs and praises have comforted the faithful for centuries, but hidden among those familiar lines is a psalm that carries a subtle mystery. Psalm 56, at first glance, seems like any other. It speaks of trust in God, of fear and deliverance, of walking in light and not in darkness, but in a small handwritten note found in the margin of a 13th century Bible, a monk wrote something unusual. "This is not for the day." That phrase prompted scholars to look deeper. What they discovered is still whispered in some corners of the Vatican today. When Psalm 56 is read backward, not just the words, but the verses in reverse order, a strange, unsettling prayer forms. The structure remains, the rhythm stays, but the meaning changes. It becomes an invocation not for strength, but for protection, not from flesh and blood enemies, but from something older, something called the Midnight Drinker. That name doesn't appear in any other official scripture, but in some minor texts, written by monks with uncertain hands and discreet ink, there are allusions to a being that walks in silence and feeds without sound. One monk, Friar Alaric of Mainz, called it the thief of sleep. Another from a mountain monastery wrote a warning. It doesn't come when invoked, but when forgotten. Light keeps it out, but this psalm drives it away. For centuries, some priests were taught to recite Psalm 56 backward during night vigils. The words, whispered in Latin, were not spoken in churches, but in crypts, in private chapels, in candlelit rooms where death had passed too close. In 1921, an old exorcist named Father Dario left a curious note in his last diary. He wrote, Psalm 56, inverted as written 3 times before dawn, calms the air, the scratches cease. No one ever knew what he meant by scratches. Today, the inverted version is no longer taught. Most priests don't even know about it, but some of the older scholars, those who spend their lives in the archives, still remember. They say it's not just a prayer, but a barrier, a line between what lives in the light and what waits in the darkness. The Vatican never speaks of the midnight drinker, and yet, in the oldest Bibles, the marginal notes remain. A candle. A soft voice. Psalm 56 backward, just in case something hears your breath while you sleep. In 1959, the Vatican quietly introduced a change to one of its oldest traditions. For centuries, church leaders had followed strict rules about how and where the faithful could be buried. Only those in full communion with the church could rest in consecrated ground. There were rules about blessings, about the orientation of the grave, even about preparing the body. But that year, something happened. The rule changed. An official document circulated without fanfare stated that in special cases, ecclesiastical authorities could order a burial outside consecrated ground, even for those who had led a holy life. No reason was given, no questions were answered. But in the handwritten notes of a Vatican archivist, something more is found. His name was Father Lucian, and he worked deep within the apostolic archives. After the change, he wrote a brief note in his personal diary. The Hungarian case is the cause. They don't want a repeat. The body wouldn't rest. That phrase prompted some researchers to investigate further. Hidden in a folder marked Special Burial Rites, there's a report dated May 1959 from a small Hungarian village. A high-ranking cardinal had died under unusual circumstances. He was buried with full honours in a crypt beneath a church, among stone and candles. But 3 days later, the priests guarding the church heard noises. At first, they thought it was mice, but the sounds grew louder. On the 5th night, a monk claimed to have heard a voice whisper the cardinal's name from behind the crypt door. On the 7th day, the candles in the church refused to stay lit. When the tomb was opened, the cardinal's body appeared fresh. His skin wasn't pale, but rosy. His mouth was open. And inside the stone coffin were deep scratches, as if something had tried to get out. The Vatican was informed. Within a week, a team arrived from Rome. They performed a rite not found in any modern manual. The body was moved and reburied away from the village. In unconsecrated ground, the faithful were told it was to prevent disease, but the church remained closed for 6 months, and the priest who had first reported what happened was removed. That same month, the burial rules were changed. Even today, the Vatican has never publicly spoken of the Hungarian case. The cardinal's name was removed from later records, and his tomb remains hidden. But the rule remained, because sometimes it's not enough to bless a body and lay it to rest. Sometimes even in the Holy Land, something stirs, and the Church, without openly declaring it, prepares for what might return. There's a special silence that falls over the Vatican shortly after midnight on Christmas Eve. The streets become still, the bells don't ring, and the air feels thick with something older than the holiday. Everyone knows about Midnight Mass, the solemn celebration in St. Peter's to commemorate the birth of Christ. It's a splendid tradition made of candles, hymns, and prayers for peace. But what almost no one knows is that at another time there was another midnight mass, a second secret rite hidden from the public eye. It was never written in liturgical calendars and wasn't celebrated in the Grand Basilica. It took place in a small underground chapel, lit only by oil lamps. The door was marked with a simple Latin phrase, Veritas Noctis, the truth of the night. Only a few clerics could participate, always 13, no more, no less. They wore black robes instead of white, and no singing was performed. The altar had no gold or flowers, and the chalice used for the rite, it was said, was carved from dark stone, not silver. According to a letter found among the private papers of a cardinal who died in 1951, this hidden mass began centuries ago. It wasn't meant to celebrate birth, but to protect the church from something it didn't fully understand. The letter called it the silent defence, a way to keep watch on the darkest night of the year, when ancient fears could awaken. The ritual included special prayers, no longer present in any official text. One was addressed not to God, but to the guardians of the threshold. Another asked that those who walk with hunger be turned away from the church's doors. During the reading, no candles were allowed, only lamps that flickered strangely with the last words. The last testimony of this mass dates back to 1912. A young seminarian, who later became a bishop, wrote in his diary that the rite had felt like being in the middle of a storm, even though the air was still. He never participated in it again, and never spoke of it in his homilies. In the mid-20th century, the ritual silently disappeared. No official announcement was made. The chapel was closed, the stone chalice locked away, the black vestments burned, but some whispers persist, that sometimes on Christmas night as midnight turns to morning, a single lamp remains lit in the underground chapel, that a few chosen men gather in silence, not to celebrate joy, but to keep watch, to ensure that nothing older than the night tries to enter the light, and that the true midnight mass was never a celebration of birth, but a dam against awakening. Beneath the grand marble floors of Vatican City lies a hidden world of stone galleries and ancient tombs, catacombs dug centuries ago to house saints, popes and forgotten priests. The air is still and cold, and the walls are lined with bones that have rested undisturbed for hundreds of years. But in the spring of 1947, something was found that didn't belong there. During maintenance work in a sealed part of the catacombs, 2 workers discovered a passage behind a collapsed wall. It had no signs, nor was it recorded on any known map. With permission from the Vatican custodian, they cleared the stones and entered, carrying only lanterns. Inside, they discovered a single stone tomb, worn by time, but strangely dust-free. On the lid, there were no symbols, no names, no dates, only a phrase lightly etched in Latin, "He must not rise." When they opened it, they expected to find bones, like in any other burial. Instead, the corpse was intact. The pale skin still seemed taut, eyes closed, mouth shut, hands resting on the chest as if recently composed. The clothing was simple but elegant, with no signs of decay. What made it even more unsettling was the date etched on the inside of the lid. 1582. That corpse, by all reasoning, should have been ash. The workers reported the discovery to the ecclesiastical authorities, who immediately sealed the chamber. The next day, a group of priests and scholars arrived. They offered prayers, wrote notes, but no official announcement was ever made. One of the workers, who years later left the trade and moved away from Rome, told a chronicler that the air around the body was icy, colder than any underground environment. He added that, at the moment the lid was replaced on the tomb, he thought he saw the deceased's lips move. The Vatican never confirmed what happened, but shortly after, that section of the catacombs was closed forever. New gates were installed. Guards began to patrol the lower levels. The passage was walled up without a trace. Some think that man had lived among the upper halls, feigning holiness and hiding a dark secret. Others believe he wasn't truly dead at the time of burial and that something ancient had preserved him from decomposition. No one knows his name, only that he lies where light doesn't reach, and that someone, long ago, etched a warning on his tomb. He must not rise. In the deepest chambers of the Vatican archives, where fragile films and tapes rest in darkness. The assistant, whose diary was found decades later, wrote about strange episodes that occurred during that visit. He spoke of a cold that invaded the house every night, even with the fireplace lit. He described shadows that didn't match the bodies casting them. He spoke of a mirror in the room that reflected the space behind him, but not his figure. On the last night, Father Malik performed a reserved rite. The assistant prepared the camera to film, as he had been ordered. No other member of the group was present. What happened during the filming remains unclear, but the assistant wrote that as soon as the ritual began, the girl in the centre opened her mouth and didn't close it again. He said she screamed, but without making any sound. Her body lifted from the ground, and all the candles went out simultaneously. The man escaped, leaving the film behind. The next morning, Father Malik was gone. The girl was gone too. The room was blackened as if burned, though nothing had actually caught fire. Only the camera remained, its film loose but unharmed. When it was brought back to Rome, it was stored in the archives. A simple label was placed on it. "Do not look." The assistant was questioned but never charged. He lived in silence and never spoke of that night again. The group's notes were sealed. The village was abandoned. Today, the film is still there. No one knows if it has ever been seen, but sometimes in the deepest corridors of the Vatican archives, that label is enough to stop even the most curious hands, because some truths should not be seen, not even on film. In a remote corner of the Vatican vaults, behind rows of ancient vases and forgotten relics, there is a glass container sealed with wax. Inside rests a clear liquid, motionless and untouched for many years. The label, written in Latin, simply says, "Holy Water, Transylvania Source, 1792. Consecrated water from a spring lost to time." But this water is not like others, and its story has been kept quiet. According to a report by a Jesuit priest from the late 18th century, it came from a small mountain village in Transylvania. The inhabitants claimed that this spring had healing powers, not only for the body but also for the soul. They maintained that it protected them from something that came at night, something they dared not speak aloud. The priest brought several vials of the spring water to Rome. He used them in private rituals. One account says the water boiled on contact with certain bones. Another noted that, placed in a silver cup under moonlight, it would turn cloudy, then red, before becoming clear again. In the early 19th century, the Church approved its use in special rites, with great caution. Only a few exorcists could use it, always under strict control. They said it acted quickly, calming violent symptoms in a few moments. One even wrote that the air seemed cleaner after its use. But something changed. In 1942, during the chaos of World War II, one of the last priests trained in the old rite reported a disturbing failure. He used the Transylvanian water in a night blessing at a monastery, where the monks had heard scratching coming from beneath the chapel floor. But when the water was sprinkled, nothing happened. On the contrary, the scratching grew more intense. In his diary, the priest wrote, "It did not hiss, it did not burn, it was just water." The Vatican withdrew the remaining vials. Most were discarded and the containers destroyed, but one was kept, sealed, studied, forgotten in the vaults. Years later, chemical analyses showed nothing particular. No sign of corruption. None. Those were his last words. Initially, the young priests thought they were ramblings, the delirium of a man about to die. But when they repeated the phrases to the doctor, his face changed. He asked for them to be transcribed word for word and sent to the Secretary of State. The message was delivered the same day. 2 days later, the Vatican archivist arrived at the Cardinal's apartments. He carried a locked box and a list of books. He spent hours removing documents, letters, and ancient volumes from the Cardinal's private library. Everything was taken in silence. The room where he had died was never used again. Years later, one of the young priests, who had been at his bedside, now old, spoke with a scholar outside the church. He remembered the strange cold that had filled the room after those last words. He said he had perceived, just for an instant, as if someone else was with them. Not the doctor, not another priest. Something invisible. The phrase, "walks in the red," haunted him his entire life. A curious detail was found in a forgotten corner of the Vatican library. A 13th century parchment described a legend about a crimson-clad figure moving beneath sacred places, feeding not on blood, but on faith. It was said that wherever it walked, candles would extinguish and prayers would die on the lips of those who spoke them. The connection was never confirmed, but the Cardinal's last words remained, whispers of a shadow that roams the tunnels beneath the Vatican, clad in red, invisible to most. Some believe it's just an old legend, a tale for the curious. Others think it was the last warning of a dying man who had seen what no one else should see. And perhaps, even today, under the great dome of St. Peter's, someone or something walks in silence, patient, hungry for what the church dares not name. It was a quiet spring morning in 1912 when the strange episode occurred. The church of Santa Lucia, a small chapel hidden among the hills outside Florence, had never been known for miracles or mysteries. It was a place of simple prayer, quiet masses, serene reflection. But what happened during an ordinary communion changed everything. During morning mass, the priest, Father Donati, was distributing the Eucharist. Everything seemed normal until an altar boy noticed something unusual. A host, which had remained on the golden parton, had turned red. Not like wine, not like dye. It pulsed. The boy whispered it to the priest, who stopped, looked, and froze. In the silent chapel, only his breathing could be heard. The host, the small consecrated bread, slowly pulsed, as if it had a heart. The red spread from the centre, like drops of blood in water. Father Donati quickly ended the Mass, saying there had been a mistake. The church was closed, and the host was placed in a tabernacle behind the altar. That night, the priest stayed inside alone. According to handwritten notes later found by church officials, the host continued to transform. By nightfall, it was a deep crimson, not dry, not dusty, but moist and warm to the touch. In the darkness, it emitted a faint glow, and for 3 nights it slowly pulsed like a living heart. The priest prayed, fasted, waited. On the 3rd night, the host stopped pulsing, becoming still and cold, but the red remained. The Vatican was immediately informed. A small group of investigators arrived at the chapel. They examined the host but did not allow it to be touched. They conducted no public tests, spoke no sermons, proclaimed no miracles. The vault, the dome of St. Peter's, glowed with a faint red light, as if the moon itself had cast its strange colour upon it. Cameras recorded the moment. News reports showed the unsettling beauty of the red dome under the red sky, but what happened next was never told. According to an internal Vatican record, leaked years later by a former night watchman, the basilica's bells began to ring on their own. It wasn't the slow toll of midnight prayer. The tolls were fast, furious, with no hands pulling the ropes. No one had been assigned to ring them. Priests from nearby buildings rushed out, thinking of a fire or an emergency. But the air was calm. There was no smoke, only the red moon above them and the sharp echo of the bells shaking the tower. Guards went up to the bell tower and found no one. Worse still, when they tried to stop the bells, the ropes wouldn't move. One of them said it seemed like they were being pulled from the other side by something unseen. The tolls suddenly ceased just as the moon turned silver again. The dome's light faded, the sky cleared, and silence returned. The Vatican issued no statement. The bells were inspected and official records spoke of a mechanical failure. But the diaries written that night by the guards tell another story. One noted, "I felt something watching us, not from the sky but from inside the dome." Since that night, the tower remained closed during all future eclipses, and although the blood moon may return, the Vatican no longer invites cameras to record the dome, because some lights reveal more than they should. In a quiet corner of Vatican City, beyond the bustling museum halls, stands a curious building with a tall, round tower. Most visitors pass by without a glance. Few know its name, but those who study the church's secrets know it as the Tower of the Winds. Built in the 16th century, the tower was used to observe the stars and the sky. It housed one of the first Vatican observatories, where priests and scientists tracked the heavens and marked time. A ray of sun, passing through a small hole in the wall, illuminated the floor at noon. It was a place of silent knowledge, but many years later the tower was closed. The door was sealed in 1960. No explanation was given. The key disappeared. Even among the staff, no one could enter. According to a report kept in the archives, the last observation was not about the sun or the stars. It was something more. In the spring of that year, 2 Jesuit astronomers were working at night, observing the sky, awaiting a rare planetary alignment. At 3:12 in the morning, one of them looked through the telescope and froze. The other, intrigued, leaned in to see. Both saw it. On the horizon, next to the moon's silhouette, there was a figure. Not a star, not a shadow. A dark, motionless figure, disturbingly shaped. It didn't move with the sky. It remained fixed, as if looking back. The telescope was clean, working. They used another. The same shape appeared, and then the tower lights went out. Both reported hearing a whisper, like voices coming from another room, but they were alone. They checked stairs, corridors, doors. No one. When the lights came back 10 minutes later, the telescope was shattered. That same morning, the director ordered the tower evacuated. No one would enter again. The Vatican guards closed the door and placed a simple sign. Closed for maintenance. It has never been reopened. Even today, the Tower of the Winds stands there, windows dark, door closed. Grass grows around its foundations. Tourists take photographs without knowing the story, but among the older priests, there are those who whisper that what was seen that night did not belong to this world. Neither angel nor star, and certainly nothing. Some believe it's a warning, others are waiting. Whatever it was, the Vatican made sure that door never opened again, and the sky above that tower remained unobserved. In the depths of the Vatican museums, far from the gleaming halls and gilded paintings, there is a small storage room that few know about. It doesn't appear on official maps. No sign leads you to it. It's behind an anonymous wooden drawer. In that room lies something that shouldn't exist. A cross with teeth. Not decorative engravings, not ornaments, but real, small, sharp teeth, embedded in the shape of a crucifix. Some say they came from a wild animal. Others believe they are human, but the truth is stranger than both. The cross was discovered in the late 19th century during an excavation led by the church in the mountains of Eastern Europe. A small chapel had been found, long buried and forgotten. Inside were signs of a strange cult, symbols not approved by the church, and relics that seemed both sacred and dangerous. Among these, hidden in a stone wall, was the cross. The wood had a pale, almost milky colour, with a surface polished by time and countless touches. What truly distinguished it were the fangs, 4 small canines embedded in the ends of the cross, penetrated so deeply that they seemed part of the wood itself. Beside it lay a worn, torn, and almost illegible note. It simply said, "To keep them away." When the object arrived in Rome, it was examined by experts, religious figures, and even medical professionals. The wood belonged to a very old tree, a species that grows exclusively in Romania. The canines presented a more complex enigma. No known creature possessed similar characteristics. They resembled human teeth, but were longer, sharper, and delicately curved towards the centre. Initially, the artifact was placed in the Museum of Curiosities, a reserved area inaccessible to ordinary visitors. Selected guests could admire extraordinary finds with enigmatic backgrounds, and that cross was among the most whispered about. But after barely 1 summer on display, something strange happened. One night, during a silent watch, a custodian discovered the protective display case cracked from the inside. No one had approached it. The room had been locked, and yet the fracture spread like spiderweb filaments, starting precisely from the embedded canines. The artifact was immediately removed and stored elsewhere. In the official museum documents, no further trace appears. However, it is still there, hidden in an unmarked drawer with only a piece of paper resting on top. On the paper, a hand-drawn sketch depicting the complete cross, accompanied by a note at the bottom, written in faded ink. Used once, only once. It worked. No one understands its original meaning or purpose, but in the dark folds of Vatican history there are tools never meant for display, and certain crosses don't just represent faith. They also serve as defence. In the depths of the Vatican's reserved archives, where only the most trusted can access, there is a dossier that many believe to be missing. It's old, thin, and marked by a faded crimson seal. It has no identity, no catalogue reference, just 3 Latin words printed on the outside, causa demissa. This is what some call the Vatican's last vampire file. It was found by chance in the early 1990s by a young archivist during his training. His job was to clean and preserve containers that had been untouched for a long time. Most held dust, old letters and forgotten files, but a small envelope caught his eye. It was made of rough paper, stained on one side, as if something dark had dripped there long ago. It had no stamps or shipping marks, and inside were a folded document and a photograph. Both deeply disturbed the archivist. The document was written in Latin, dated November 10th, 1928. It described a secret investigation ordered by an anonymous bishop into strange deaths at a Hungarian church. The victims were found pale, with no signs of violence, and each had been buried twice. First in the cemetery, then in a hidden spot after they somehow reappeared. The report was short, no names, no solution. At the end, written in red ink, was a single sentence. Causa demissa, no further investigation authorised. The photograph was even more unsettling. It showed a man in church clothes at the edge of a forest. His face was pale, his gaze slightly away from the camera, but what stood out most was the shadow behind him. It didn't match his shape. It looked longer, thinner, and the head was strangely shaped, more squished, with a pointy part where the mouth should be. On the back of the photo were the initials BU Index. That code only shows up in a few church records. It's thought to mean a special office under Pope Benedict XV. Some guess it means beyond the 15th, a way to classify events never meant to be shared, not even in private church files. The archivist who found the file tried to get answers. Within 7 days, he was moved to a quiet church in the hills of southern Italy. He never went back to the archives. The envelope is still there, according to an old keeper who once guarded the reserved vault. It rests in a red-lined drawer, untouched since it was found. Nobody talks about it, nobody opens it. Because sometimes, when the church says a case is closed, what it really means is that it should never be looked at again. There are many things the church shares publicly, stories of saints and sinners, miracles and martyrs, light and darkness. But some things are only passed on in whispers, from one religious person to another, hidden in teachings, never written down. These are the things the church doesn't say out loud. In the Vatican's training schools, there are secret lessons. Not all students get them, only those chosen for special jobs. Often at night, in quiet places away from the main classrooms, an old priest sits with a young churchman and speaks softly. No books, no notes, just words that should never leave that room. In these secret teachings, religious people are warned about things not found in any church book. One warning is about pale beings, not ghosts, not devils, but something different. The information passed down for centuries describes them as those who pretend to live, move like humans, speak in soft voices, and blend in plain sight. The term undead is never said, but the signs are always the same. No breathing, no reflexes, eyes that glow in the dark, and a hunger not for food, but for something more important. Some priests are told about towns that still do strange funeral rituals, using metal bars and tightly sealed coffins. The church doesn't stop them. Instead, it quietly lets old traditions continue because, as these hidden teachings say, old fears are often right. There are also warnings about certain holy objects that shouldn't be moved, things that look holy but aren't. Crosses with upside-down shadows, cups that feel warm in cold air, objects tainted by the bloodless ones, and then there are the doors. Some European chapels and monasteries have sealed rooms, chained from the inside, never opened again, no services held there. No reason is given, but when a visiting religious person asks why, the older ones just shake their heads, wait, and that's all they say. The Vatican has never said any of this is true. There are no official papers or signed orders, just the personal notebooks of exorcists, the faded writings of missionaries, and warnings passed on like delicate secrets. In 1967, a retired bishop was asked in a private talk if the church believed in vampires. He was silent for a long time, then answered, "We believe in what we must protect ourselves from." When asked to explain, he smiled and whispered, "There are things that take our form." That recording was never made public. So, the silence continues. No sermon, no official statement. But in the oldest halls of the church, in the late hours of the night, the truth is still passed on in hushed tones, because there are things that cannot be denied, even if they are never said out loud. Thanks for staying with us until the end. If any of these hidden stories made you think or gave you a chill, tell us in the comments. We always love to read what impressed you the most, and if you haven't already, remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you never miss a new mystery. Stay curious, keep listening, and until next time, rest well.